She spent 6 years being perfect for a man who was already looking at someone else. 6 years of silence, sacrifice, and steel-spined composure. And when the moment finally came, King Dareth Solmere didn't even have the decency to look her in the eye when he threw her away. But here's what they didn't count on. Women built by betrayal don't break. They redirect. And the North was already waiting for her with something no Southern court could ever offer, the truth of what she actually was. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's ride this out together. The dissolution decree arrived on a Tuesday. Not that the day mattered, not that any particular hour could carry more cruelty than another. But Seris Vaelor would remember it as Tuesday because she had spent Monday evening restitching the hem of a blue gown she planned to wear to the winter assembly, sitting beside a candle in her assigned chambers, humming something without words, feeling, for the first time in recent memory, something adjacent to peace. Tuesday ended that. The Crimson Court's main chamber smelled the way it always did in winter. Burning cedar from the eastern fireplaces, candle wax, cold stone beneath warmed air, and underneath all of it, the particular metallic scent of old ambition that had soaked into the walls over centuries. Rain came down beyond the tall windows. Not soft rain, hard rain, the kind that streaks glass like something trying to get inside, like nature imitating grief. Seris stood in the center of the marble floor, because she had been told to stand there, and she had complied because 6 years of court life had taught her that compliance was its own form of armor. She wore gray. She always wore gray in formal proceedings. Not because it suited her, silver eyes and pale skin could carry stronger colors, but because gray communicated nothing, and communicating nothing had kept her alive in this court longer than any strategy she had consciously designed. She had 17 people standing behind her, attendants, ladies in waiting, 2 scribes, a protocol officer who existed primarily to ensure nobody violated procedural etiquette during moments of state business. None of them mattered in that moment. What mattered was the throne, and the fact that King Dareth Solmere was not looking at her. He sat in the elevated seat of carved red stone, wearing his winter ceremonial coat, dark blue trimmed in silver. The kind of carefully assembled presentation that communicated authority without requiring the person inside it to do much work. Dareth was handsome in a calculated way. The jaw slightly too square, the posture slightly too practiced, every element of his appearance suggesting a man who had spent considerable effort looking like someone who didn't try. He held a goblet of something he wasn't drinking. His thumb moved in a slow circle against its rim. His gaze was directed to the left of the throne, specifically at Lady Marin Cosiel, who stood in the shadow of the secondary dais wearing a red dress and the particular expression of someone trying very hard to appear unaware of being watched. Seris had noticed this approximately 4 minutes after entering the chamber. She filed it away. She did not react. The thing about betrayal, the real mechanics of it, the part nobody discusses, is that it rarely arrives as a surprise. It arrives as a confirmation. The body already knows. The mind already suspects. The stomach has already tightened on 100 different evenings over words slightly too careful or silences slightly too long. What the formal announcement does is simply remove the last small mercy of uncertainty. Chancellor Bren Fossick stepped forward with his scroll. He had been chancellor for 22 years and had announced proclamations of war, death, alliance, and consequence without visible emotion for all of them. He possessed the professional blankness of a man who had made peace with being the instrument of other people's decisions rather than a participant in them. He unrolled the scroll with practiced hands. By the authority of the Crimson Throne, Fossick began, and his voice carried that particular flat gravity that told Seris everything before the words arrived. And in accordance with the genealogical review conducted by the Council of Bloodlines over the past 8 months, 8 months. She had not known it was 8 months. She filed that away too. It has been determined that the promised bond between Lady Seris of House Vaelor and His Majesty King Dareth Solmere contains a discrepancy of ancestral record that renders the agreement administratively void under Southern Imperial law. The discrepancy pertains to third-generation bloodline verification in the Vaelor maternal line, which, upon closer examination, reveals Seris stopped listening to the specific language. Not because she couldn't process it. She was processing it completely. She was recording every word, cataloging every inflection, noting the way Fawcett's voice lifted slightly on administrative, as though the word itself was doing him a favor, giving this whole thing a clean procedural face instead of what it actually was. She stopped listening to the specifics because she was busy doing something more important. She was watching Dareth's thumb continue its slow circle against the goblet rim. He still wasn't looking at her. That told her everything the scroll didn't. This wasn't bloodline administration. There was no discrepancy. The Vaelor maternal line was impeccable and had been verified twice before the original bond agreement was signed. She had read the documentation herself 3 years ago in this same building because she had always believed in knowing the architecture of her own situation. What this was, dressed up in procedural language and delivered by a man too professional to show shame, was simple. Dareth had decided he wanted something else, and the machinery of Southern governance was flexible enough to accommodate that decision if you held enough of its levers, which he did. The scroll continued for another 90 seconds. When it concluded, Fawcett rolled it back with the same efficient hands and stepped to the side. The chamber was very quiet. Rain kept working on the glass. Seris counted 4 breaths before she spoke. Not because she needed to compose herself. She was already composed, had been composed before she entered this room, had built that composure over a decade of learning that showing damage to people who caused it was a form of surrender she could not afford. She counted 4 breaths because she wanted to be certain that when she opened her mouth, every word landed with the weight she intended. "Chancellor Fawcett," she said. Her voice came out steady. Not cold. Cold suggested suppressed heat. Steady suggested something more dangerous, someone who had already moved past the emotional register entirely and arrived at a place of pure assessment. Fawcett looked at her. "Is the discrepancy documented?" she asked. A pause. "It is, my lady." "Then I would like a copy of that documentation before I depart." Another pause, slightly longer. "That can be arranged." "Good." She turned her gaze to the throne then. Not to Dareth specifically, but to the space slightly above his head, which was a technique she had learned from watching experienced diplomats deliver uncomfortable truths. You look at the general area of power without granting the person in it the intimacy of eye contact. "I assume transport will be provided." Dareth finally looked at her. His expression was complicated in the way that expressions become complicated when a person has rehearsed sympathy and discovered it doesn't quite fit their face. "Seris?" he began. "Transport," she repeated. Not louder, not sharper, simply repeated, with the exact same inflection, which was somehow worse. "Yes," he said. "Of course." She nodded once. She turned and walked out of the chamber with 17 people trailing behind her, and she did not look at Lady Marin Cassiel as she passed, even though Marin was standing close enough that Seris could see the particular pink in her cheeks that appeared when someone was trying to contain triumph. She didn't give Marin the satisfaction of being looked at. She walked all the way to her chambers, dismissed every attendant with a quiet word and a gesture, closed the door, sat down in the chair beside the window, and watched rain do its work on the courtyard below for approximately 11 minutes. Then she started packing. Not because transport had been arranged, it hadn't yet, and wouldn't be until morning at the earliest, because courts moved slowly even when urgency was politically convenient. She started packing because doing something with her hands was the only honest thing left available to her, and because the act of selecting objects and placing them in order gave the mind something to organize when the mind was working very hard not to examine the full scale of what had just occurred. Her attendant Priska knocked at the 7th hour. Priska was 43, had served Seris for 4 of the 6 years, and possessed the emotional intelligence of someone who had spent decades managing the wreckage of other people's formal disasters. She entered without excessive expression, looked at the half-filled travel cases, looked at Seris sitting in the chair, and said nothing immediately. "They sent dinner," Priska finally offered. "I'm not hungry." "I know." She set the tray on the side table anyway. "I also brought the documentation you requested. Fawcett had it ready surprisingly fast." "Of course he did." Seris took the folded papers without looking at them yet. "He had it ready before I asked." Priska sat in the second chair without being invited, which was one of the things Seris valued about her. She didn't perform the rituals of deference when they were alone. She just occupied space honestly. "It's fabricated," Priska said quietly. Not a question. The maternal line discrepancy is in the third generation, Seris said. My great-grandmother's birth record. The record that exists in Vaelor family archives, which have been sealed to external review for 40 years, which means anyone trying to verify that particular generation would have to go on documentation provided by sources outside our family. Sources that can be shaped. Sources that were shaped. She unfolded the papers now, ran her eyes down them. The language was careful, thorough, exactly right in all the ways that forged documents always are. Too complete, too tidy, no ambiguity anywhere, which is precisely the tell, because real historical records always carry ambiguity, because real history is always partially lost. 8 months, she said. He started this 8 months ago. Priska said nothing. Marin Kossiel has been at court for 9 months, Seris said. Still nothing. 1 month, Seris said. He met her. And within 1 month he was already building the architecture of removing me. She set the papers down on the side table beside the untouched dinner. That is not a betrayal born of passion, Priska. That's a project. That's a man looking at a woman he's been promised to for 6 years and deciding that a newer option is worth constructing an 8-month legal dismantlement. Priska leaned forward slightly. What do you want to do? It was the right question. Not what should she do, not what was expected of her, but what did she want? Seris looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. She was vaguely aware that they perhaps should be, that this was the kind of moment in which some visible physical evidence of distress would be understandable, even appropriate. 6 years. 6 years of being present and careful and politically useful and personally contained. 6 years of performing the function of a promised sovereign consort with enough precision that the court had largely stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a fixture, as predictable and unremarkable as the furniture. She had been so careful. She had been so precisely, exhaustingly careful, and it had bought her exactly nothing. I want the documentation copy, she said. I want transport north, and I want to not speak to anyone in this palace between now and dawn. Priska nodded, started to rise. And Priska, the older woman paused. I don't want pity from anyone. Not from you, not from the attendants, not from anyone who comes to say goodbye in the morning. I want nothing from this court except a clean exit. Understood. After Priska left, Seris sat alone with the rain and the untouched dinner, and the manufactured documentation of her own worthlessness, and she did something that would have surprised anyone who had spent the last 6 years watching her perform composure. She felt the full weight of it. Not tears, not quite, but the thing underneath tears. The real substance of it. The particular ache of a person who had built an entire architecture of self around a future that never existed, who had organized her aspirations and her discipline and her daily careful choices around a destination that turned out to be a painted backdrop instead of a real place. She felt it completely. For 11 minutes. Then she finished packing. Because the other thing nobody discusses about women who survive betrayal is this. The composure isn't performed. It's earned. Every time you choose to keep moving instead of collapsing, you deposit something into a reserve that eventually becomes structural. You don't decide not to fall apart. You simply discover, in the moment of testing, that the foundation is stronger than the damage being applied to it. Seris had been building that foundation since she was 14 years old, and her father told her that a Vaelor woman's greatest weapon was the ability to be underestimated. She was about to discover just how correct he had been. The transport departed before dawn. 3 coaches, reduced from the 7 that had accompanied her arrival 6 years prior, which was its own quiet statement. The courtyard was empty except for essential staff. No formal farewell. No ceremony. The dissolution was already yesterday's business, and courts moved forward from their own ugliness with remarkable efficiency when the alternative was sustained acknowledgement of what they'd done. Priska rode inside with her. 2 guards rode outside. The rest of the reduced household, 3 attendants, a cook who had been with the family longer than anyone and refused to stay behind, distributed themselves between the 2nd and 3rd coaches. The city of Draven was dark and wet when they passed through it. Shop fronts shuttered, gutters running hard with collected rain. A few figures under awnings watching the coaches pass with the mild attention people give to things that aren't their business. Nobody knew who was leaving. Nobody would know until the court wanted them to, and the court would frame it as administrative correction and move along. Seris watched the city through the window as it slid past. She had lived within its boundaries for 6 years and had never quite belonged to it, had never felt the specific ease of a person in a place where they fit. Always slightly outside the rhythm of it, always the northerner in the southern court, always the gray-wearing woman who never quite gave anyone enough to hold against her. She was leaving nothing behind that had been truly hers. That was, perhaps, the particular mercy of this. The road north began 3 hours past Draven's outer gates, where the flat southern landscape started its gradual argument with itself. Low hills building toward higher ground, the cultivated fields thinning and being replaced by scrub grass and sparse trees carrying the last resistance of autumn leaves. The rain continued for most of the morning and then stopped, leaving a sky the color of old iron and a silence that felt enormous after the constant sound of water. Priska slept. Seris did not. She spent the journey reading, not the fabricated dissolution documents, which she had already fully understood and would deal with through appropriate channels when she had more leverage than she currently possessed. She read the one book she had kept on her person rather than packed, a genealogical history of the Northern Territories that she had found in the court library 4 years ago, and had been working through in fragments whenever she had time, drawn to it by something she couldn't quite articulate, a specific interest in the pre-unification period when the Northern Empire was still a collection of autonomous territories, each with its own bloodline traditions and sovereign claims. She had no particular reason to be reading it now. She read it anyway. They stopped at the Crossroads Inn at midday, a low building that had been serving travelers at the junction of the north and east roads for what the proprietor claimed was 200 years, and Seris estimated was actually closer to 60 based on the construction technique visible in the exposed roof beams. She sat in the common room at a table near the fire with Priska and ate the first thing she had eaten since the previous morning. Bread, hard cheese, something that approximated soup, and tried not to think about the fact that she had no clear destination. The dissolution had specified that she could return to the Vaelor family seat in the Eastern Territories, which was the appropriate proceeding. Her family would receive her with the particular careful warmth that families apply to returned members who carry difficult histories. Her aunt would be practical and kind. Her younger cousins would be curious and poorly trained at concealing it. Life would resume in a different key, with different walls, with the specific quality of a person trying to occupy a present that doesn't fit because the future they built it around no longer exists. She was trying to decide how she felt about that when the inn door opened and the cold air came in with 2 riders she didn't recognize. Not the riders themselves. Their faces were unfamiliar, northern in their coloring and bearing, wearing travel clothes without visible insignia. What she recognized was something less specific, the quality of attention they brought into the room with them, the way they surveyed the space without appearing to survey it, the way one of them located her within 3 seconds of entering and then looked away with a precision that told her the looking away had been intentional. She kept eating. The first rider, taller, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to a man who spent his professional life outdoors in difficult conditions, approached the proprietor and spoke in a low voice. The second stationed himself near the door without being obvious about it, which was sufficiently obvious to Seris. She said quietly to Priska, "We have company." Priska set down her bread and looked up with the controlled expression of someone who had been a member of enough political households to know what those words meant. The tall rider came to her table. He stood at a respectful distance, not aggressive, not deferential, somewhere specifically between those registers in a way that suggested training. "Lady Seris Vaelor," he said, not a question. "I don't know you," she said. "No, my lady. My name is Corin. I serve Varynth." That landed with a particular weight. She set her spoon down. Varynth, the Northern Empire's core fortress, the seat of Caelin Draven, who had ruled the North for 11 years and whose name appeared in the political dispatches she had read over the years primarily in the context of border conflicts, trade pressures, and the particular reputation of a man who had turned his territory from a collection of fractious provinces into the most consolidated power in the North, through methods that were effective and not always comfortable to examine closely. "Varynth sent riders to the Crossroads Inn," she said. "Varynth sent riders to intercept your transport before it turned east," Corin said. She looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because His Majesty King Caelin Draven requests the courtesy of your continued travel north rather than east. Priska beside her made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "A request," Seris said. "Yes, my lady." "With how many accompanying riders?" Something moved in Corin's expression, almost appreciation. 12, my lady, positioned half a mile north of the crossroads. So a request accompanied by 12 riders. The riders are for safety, not compulsion. People always say that. Yes, he agreed. They do. Whether it's true depends on who's asking. She studied him. He was not lying. Or rather, he was not lying in the obvious ways that liars occupy themselves. He held eye contact without aggression, kept his hands visible and still, breathed at a normal rate. A professional. A man who served someone he respected, which meant someone worth respecting, at least in his judgment. "What does the king of Varynth want with me?" she asked. "That," Corin said, "I am not authorized to explain, only to deliver." Convenient. Honest. She looked at the door, considered the East Road and its practical destination and the life awaiting her there, contained, managed, reduced in scale and possibility. Considered the North Road, which led to a fortress she had read about in a genealogical history 4 years ago, for reasons she still couldn't entirely explain, and to a king who had sent 12 riders to redirect her fate on the day she had been thrown away. 12 riders. Dispatched from Varynth, which was 300 miles north of this inn, which meant they had been dispatched before the dissolution was announced publicly, before she had left Draven, possibly before the decree itself. "How long ago were these riders sent?" she asked. Corin's expression changed slightly. Just the eyes. The kind of change that means a question has landed where the person asking it intended. "I'm not authorized to answer that either," he said. "No," she said. "I imagine you're not." She sat with it for a moment. Outside the inn, the iron sky was doing something complicated. Not quite clearing, not quite worsening, simply holding in that particular suspended state of early northern winter, where the weather itself seems to be deciding whether to commit to something. There are moments in a life where the choice in front of you is so fundamentally different in quality from the life behind you that it registers as its own kind of physics. The East Road was familiar. It was reduced. It was the life of someone who had been discarded and gone home to manage that fact in private. The North Road was unknown in ways that felt specific, not random unknown, but purposeful unknown. The kind that exists when someone who has done their research comes to find you before you know you're findable. Seris Vaelor had spent 6 years being underestimated. She looked at Corin. "I'll need 20 minutes," she said. She walked out into the cold air of the courtyard where the coaches stood, and her small household waited, and she stood for a moment with her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the north sky, and she let herself understand what she was about to do. She was choosing the unknown over the known. She was walking toward a fortress she had never visited because a man she had never met had sent riders to find her on the day she had nothing left to lose. A reasonable person would call this reckless. Seris called it honest, because she had tried careful. She had tried correct. She had tried performing exactly the prescribed function within the prescribed parameters, and she had discovered what always waits at the end of that path. Someone else's decision about your worth. Someone else's architecture that you've been building toward and living inside without ever having actually chosen it. She was done with architecture that wasn't hers. She told Priska first. Priska listened without interruption, which meant she had already been watching the riders and drawing her own conclusions. "I'll go if you go," Priska said simply. "You don't have to." "I know." She was already moving toward the coach. 20 minutes, you said." The small household rearranged itself with a practicality that Seris found deeply valuable. Her cook muttered something dark under his breath and then started repacking provisions for a longer journey. Both guards recalculated the route without being asked, and the attendants did what attendants do when their principal is doing something uncertain. They followed without ceremony because the alternative was going home, and they had all already made that choice at dawn when they'd climbed into the coaches. When they pulled out of the crossroads inn yard and turned north instead of east, Corin and his companion fell in alongside without fanfare. The 12 riders joined them half a mile up the road. Seris watched them materialize from the tree line with the clean efficiency of people who had been waiting in exactly the right positions for exactly the right amount of time, and she noted the horses. Northern stock, heavy built, suited for altitude and sustained cold. not the kind of animal you brought south for a short errand. These riders had been prepared for the possibility that she might say no. They had come with the logistics to accompany her the full distance regardless. The thought sat with her for a long time as the road began its northward argument with elevation, and the southern flatlands receded behind them, and the sky started doing the specific thing that skies do when winter has genuinely committed to itself. What kind of man sends 12 riders 300 miles south on the day a woman is thrown away? What kind of man plans for the possibility of her refusal with the same logistical thoroughness as her acceptance? The genealogical history was in her travel bag. She found the section on Varynth without difficulty. Read it again in the moving coach while Priska slept and the road wound north and the temperature dropped with the rising ground. The text was dry, academic, written by someone more interested in bloodline continuity than in the human stories contained within them. But in the margins, in her own handwriting from 4 years ago, she had made a note. She found it in the section covering the pre-unification sovereign queens of the Northern Territories. The note said simply, Vaelor maternal line. Check 3rd generation. She stared at it for a long time. She had written that note 4 years ago. The same generation the forged dissolution documents had targeted. Her hands did not shake. But something in her chest did something complicated. Some motion that wasn't fear and wasn't hope, but occupied the territory between them. The specific sensation of a person who is beginning to suspect that the story they are living is much larger than the chapter they can currently see. The coaches moved north. The wolves of Varynth rode alongside. And the Iron Crown, old as the mountains, heavier than any metal, forged from the particular alloy of sovereignty and sacrifice, waited in the obsidian fortress 300 miles ahead, already knowing the name of the woman who would eventually wear it. 3 days north of the crossroads, in the last civilized inn before the mountain approach to Varynth, Corin came to her door at the 7th hour of evening. She was already awake. We'll reach the fortress by midday tomorrow, he said. I thought you'd want the night to consider anything you want to ask before we arrive. I have a question now, she said. I'll answer what I can. Why does the king of Varynth know my name? A pause, long enough to be meaningful. Every king knows the names of people who matter, Corin said. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's the answer I'm authorized to give. She looked at him steadily. The dissolution documents targeted my maternal line, 3rd generation, a record that could only be falsified using external documentation from sources outside my family archive. Does the king of Varynth know about that? The pause this time was different, shorter, more like a man who was deciding something than a man who was checking against his instructions. His Majesty's archive, Corin said carefully, is extensive. How extensive? My lady. He met her eyes. His were serious in the way of a person carrying information they're not supposed to share, but who has the decency to let you know it exists. Get some sleep. There will be a great deal to understand tomorrow. He started to turn. Corin. He stopped. Did he know, she said, before they moved against my bloodline record? Did Varynth know before Dareth started building the dissolution? The silence that followed was the longest yet. And then Corin said with the careful precision of a man choosing each word as though laying explosive, His Majesty has been watching the Vaelor bloodline records for longer than 8 months. He left before she could respond. She stood in the doorway of the inn room for a long time after his footsteps faded. Outside, the mountain wind was doing its work on the eaves, a low, sustained sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite warning, the voice of an altitude that had been here long before human concerns and would be here long after. Longer than 8 months. She thought about the genealogical history, the margin note in her own handwriting, the uncanny specific accuracy of the dissolution documents targeting the exact generation that mattered. The 12 riders who had been waiting half a mile north of the crossroads for a woman who hadn't yet decided where she was going. Someone had been watching. Someone had known. And tomorrow, 300 miles north of the life she had been promised, and the life she had planned and every careful architecture she had constructed, in the space between her own ambitions and other people's expectations, she would walk into the obsidian fortress of Varynth and stand in front of the man who had rerouted her fate, and find out whether he had done it to save her, or because he needed her for something she didn't yet understand. She did not sleep until well past midnight. And when she finally did, she dreamed of an iron crown sitting on a cold stone floor in an empty room, surrounded by dust and old light, waiting with the absolute patience of something that had been waiting for centuries, waiting for a name to return to it. Her name. The convoy started before dawn. The mountain road required the early start. The approach to Varynth was not treacherous in the conventional sense, not cliffside passes or unstable ground, but it was sustained and demanding, a road built by people who didn't want the journey to be easy because ease attracts the wrong visitors. The stones were well maintained, the grade consistent, the markings clear. But the cold was absolute, and the wind came off the upper ridges with the focused intention of something that had decided to test its visitors before they arrived. Seris rode the final stretch on horseback. She had made this decision after the first hour in the coach, when the road's quality of motion changed, and she realized that arriving in Varynth inside a southern transport vehicle was the wrong first impression. Not for Kaelin Draven's benefit. She didn't know yet what his impressions required. For her own. She needed to arrive as herself, not as a passenger. Corin had a horse ready without being asked, which told her he had expected this, which told her something about who had briefed him about her. The northern landscape was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they've never tried to be anything but what they are. No cultivated beauty, no managed wilderness, just stone and sky and the particular blue-gray of frozen elevation, the trees that survived up here doing so through the specific talent of not caring about elegance and caring entirely about grip, roots wrapped around rock like arguments, branches stripped to functional honesty by seasons of wind. She found it beautiful. She also found it familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She had never been this far north. She knew this landscape the way you sometimes know a piece of music you've never heard, recognizing it not from memory, but from something deeper, some structural alignment between the thing and a part of yourself that doesn't speak in the language of experience. The fortress appeared at the third hour, not gradually. Suddenly, which was architecturally intentional, a curve in the road, and then Varynth was simply there, black stone rising from the mountain's northern face with the presence of something that had grown from the rock rather than been built upon it. Towers without ornamentation. Walls without apology. Gates of dark iron standing open with the confidence of a structure that didn't close itself against things it was prepared to handle. And in the courtyard, when she rode through the gates, something happened that she had not been prepared for. The warriors stopped, not at a command, not in the choreographed way of formal arrival preparation. They stopped the way bodies stop when something happens that the nervous system registers before the mind does. That reflexive animal pause of instinctive recognition, the same motion that crosses a crowd when lightning strikes near enough to be felt. The black-cloaked soldiers looked at her, and then, one by one, with the unhurried certainty of people doing something they didn't need to think about, they lowered their heads, not bowing, not the formal submission of court procedure, something older, something that had nothing to do with anyone's instructions. Seris kept her face still and her spine straight and her hands light on the reins, and she felt the weight of it land on her like weather. Enormous, sourceless, impossible to deflect. She reached the top of the courtyard where granite steps led to the main entrance. He was standing there. She had expected ceremony, some version of court presentation, the formal apparatus of meeting conducted through established channels of protocol. What she found instead was a man in dark military linen standing on his own steps with stone dust on his hands, and the specific quality of someone who had been doing actual work before this and hadn't particularly rearranged himself for the occasion. Kaelin Draven was tall in the way that men are tall when it's a fact about them rather than an asset they've cultivated. Gray eyes, the kind of face that had been severe even in youth and had found, with time, a way to make severity look like landscape. Permanent, feature rather than expression. No crown, no ceremony. He looked at her. And whatever she had expected to feel in this moment, calculation, fear, the sharp awareness of political exposure, none of that arrived on schedule. What arrived instead was the sensation of being looked at by someone who was actually looking, not at the gray dress or the silver eyes or the political value of the bloodline attached to her name, at her. She dismounted without assistance and climbed the steps until she stood on the same level. They were 6 feet apart. The warriors behind her had gone silent. "Lady Seris Vaelor," he said, His voice was even, the particular evenness of someone who has trained themselves out of the performative registers and arrived somewhere functional and unimpressed with its own gravity. "King Kaelin Draven," she said. A pause. "Your ride from the crossroads was without incident?" "It was." She held his gaze. "Your riders are professional." "They are." Another pause. The kind of pause that isn't awkward, but is honest. Two people taking the measure of each other with the seriousness the situation deserves, without pretending the measure isn't happening. "I have questions," she said. "I know. I'd like answers." "You'll have them." He stepped aside from the doorway in a gesture that was simultaneously an invitation and a statement. That she was being received, not escorted, not managed. That the space behind the door was being offered rather than granted. "Come inside." She stepped through the entrance of Varynth. Behind her, stone dust still marked the king's hands. Behind her, the warriors of the north stood with lowered heads in the cold courtyard. And somewhere in the archive beneath this fortress, buried under centuries of erased history and dead dynasties, a name burned in the old language like fire touching oil. A name that was hers. A name that explained everything she had thought she understood about the life she was living. A name that was about to change every wall she had ever built around herself. She walked deeper into the obsidian fortress. She did not yet know that the archive key was already missing from its lock. She did not yet know that someone had been inside the archive 3 nights prior. She did not yet know that the record she was about to discover had already been seen by eyes she hadn't yet identified. Eyes that would rather burn this fortress to its foundations than let Seris Vaelor understand what her bloodline actually meant. The door closed behind her. The cold stayed outside. And the iron crown waited in the dark below. The archive key had been missing for 3 days. Seris didn't know that yet. She was standing in the entrance hall of Varynth, absorbing the specific quality of a space that had been built to outlast the ambitions of the people moving through it. And the missing key was a fact existing 2 floors below her in the dark, patient as a held breath, waiting for her to become relevant enough to need it. The entrance hall was nothing like the Southern Palace. No ornament, no gold leaf, no ceiling murals depicting the victories of dead men in flattering light. The walls here were raw obsidian cut in large blocks, fitted with a precision that made the joints nearly invisible, and whatever craftsman had built this place had apparently decided that the stone itself was enough. The floors were dark slate worn smooth by centuries of boots. The light came from iron sconces burning oil, not candles, which produced a steadier and more functional illumination than the performative candlelight of courts designed to look beautiful. It looked, Seris thought, like a place built by someone who expected to actually live in it. Kaelin walked ahead of her at a pace that was neither rushed nor ostentatiously unhurried, simply moving through his own space with the unself-consciousness of a man who had long stopped thinking about how he appeared in it. 2 members of his household guard followed at a distance that was protective without being surveillance. "This way," he said. "Not please follow me, or if you'll permit me to show you. Just this way, the direction of someone who assumed you would make reasonable decisions and didn't require management." She followed. He took her to a receiving room on the 2nd floor. Not the throne room, which she noticed they had passed without entering, and not the formal council chamber visible through open doors along the corridor. This room was smaller. A fire going in a wide stone hearth. A table with chairs around it that had the worn quality of furniture that was actually used. Maps on the walls, not tapestries. Real maps, annotated, pinned with markers at specific points that told the history of 11 years of active border management if you knew how to read them. She read them. Kaelin watched her read them. "You know cartography," he said. "I know what to look for," she said. She moved closer to the largest map, the Northern Territories in full detail, and found the cluster of markers along the eastern ridge that indicated something ongoing rather than historical. "These eastern markers are new. 3 months. Border pressure?" "Border testing," he said. "There's a distinction." "Who's doing the testing?" A pause. Not reluctance. Consideration. "That," he said, "connects to why you're here." She turned from the map and faced him directly. This was the moment she had been building toward since the Crossroads Inn. the place where the conversation stopped being navigation and became the actual thing. Then let's get there, she said. I've been traveling for 3 days behind a question I wasn't given the answer to. I understand why your man Corin kept his instructions. I understand operational security. But I'm in your fortress now, and I think we're past the point where careful management of information serves either of us. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she had noticed in the courtyard. Not assessment exactly, something more thorough than that. The look of a person processing multiple layers of what they're seeing and doing it honestly, rather than performing the appearance of consideration. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. The smallest possible shift in his expression, not quite surprise. Recalibration. Suit yourself, he said, and sat down himself, which she hadn't expected. She had been prepared for him to remain standing as a counter-assertion of physical authority. Instead, he settled into the chair with the ease of someone who didn't need height to maintain presence, and she found that more interesting than if he had stayed on his feet. He put his hands flat on the table, still stone dust in the creases of his knuckles. The Vaelor bloodline, he said. Tell me what you know about it. That's not an answer, she said. That's a test. Call it a starting point. She decided to give him what he asked for, not because she was performing compliance, but because she was curious where his version of this differed from hers. The Vaelor family is 3 centuries old in the Eastern Territories, she said. Originally a merchant dynasty that accumulated enough land and political leverage to be granted minor noble status during the Third Consolidation. My father's line is straightforward. My mother's line is older and less documented, which is unusual for families of our standing, and which I noticed when I was young and was told was simply a function of record loss during the border conflicts of the previous century. She paused. I believed that until I was about 18. Then I stopped believing it and started asking different questions. What questions? Why the maternal records stop at my great-grandmother's generation? Why there's a gap of 12 years in the family archive that covers exactly the period following the collapse of the northern pre-unification territories? Why my mother, who was not a trained scholar, kept a personal collection of northern historical documents that she never discussed with anyone in the family except me. Kaelin was very still. And what did you conclude? He said. I concluded that someone had deliberately made the trail difficult, which is different from a trail that was naturally lost. Natural loss is random. What I was looking at was selective. Specific generations, specific records, nothing upstream and nothing downstream, just that window of time and that branch of the family. You're right, he said. Just that. You're right. No preamble, no softening. She had expected him to make her work harder for it. The maternal line, he said, traces through 12 generations to the sovereign queens of the Northern Territories before unification. Not noble blood, not honorary designation. The original ruling bloodline of what is now the eastern half of my empire. Blood that carries the old claim to these territories and, under the founding compact of Varynth, supersedes any arrangement made after unification. Seris stood very still. That's what the dissolution documents targeted, she said. Yes, Dareth's people found it. Dareth's people were told where to find it, Kaelin said, and something in his voice changed on that. Not louder, not harder, but concentrated. The specific density of a man who has been holding a piece of information in his hands for long enough that it has left a mark. Someone gave them the exact generation, the exact record to falsify. No one without access to the Varynth archive could have known which records would matter. The fire in the hearth made a sound. Seris felt the room rearrange itself around this fact. Someone with access to your archive, she said, told the Southern Court which records to falsify to neutralize me before I had any idea I needed to be neutralized. Yes. Who? I don't know yet. He said it without apparent frustration, which told her he had already exhausted frustration on this question and arrived at something more functional. The archive is accessible to 6 people in this fortress. I've been eliminating possibilities for 3 months. The eastern border testing started at the same time as the information leak, which tells me the 2 events are connected, which tells me whoever did this isn't working alone. Seris pulled a chair out and sat down, not because she was tired, because she needed to think, and sitting was more honest than standing when thinking was the actual activity. You knew before they moved against my records, she said. Corin as much as confirmed it. I knew your bloodline was significant. I had been tracking the Vaelor maternal records for 2 years before the dissolution. I didn't move quickly enough. He said the last part without self-pity and without performance, simply as a statement of operational failure. The kind of thing a man says when he has already assessed his own mistake and has no interest in being absolved of it. I should have made contact earlier. I didn't. The dissolution happened before I could establish ground. Why didn't you move earlier? He looked at her steadily. Because making contact with a woman promised to another king without a clear and legitimate reason would have been interpreted as political interference and given Dareth grounds to accelerate the very action I was trying to prevent. The logic was clean. She could see it. She could also see the thing he wasn't quite saying. That's the operational reason, she said. A pause. Yes, he said. What's the other reason? The pause this time was longer. Here is something about men who rule alone. They develop a relationship with silence that is almost architectural. They use it the way other people use walls, the way fortresses use distance. Kaelin Draven had spent 11 years alone at the center of a machine that depended on his clarity and certainty, and he had learned to occupy silence with the full weight of himself rather than filling it with the noise that less secure people substitute for substance. But there are silences that are honest and silences that are armored, and Seris had spent 6 years in a court built almost entirely on the latter. She could tell the difference. This one was armored. I'll ask again later, she said, giving him the exit without making it a concession, and watched something in his shoulders acknowledge the courtesy without quite relaxing. The archive is on the lower level, he said. I'll have Corin take you when you're ready. The relevant documents are in the 3rd vault. He stood. Your chambers are on the north wing. I had them prepared with materials you might want for extended research. The collection your mother kept was transferred here 4 years ago. Seris stopped. My mother's collection, she said. My mother has been dead for 6 years. Her collection was inventoried as part of the family estate. It was, Kaelin said, and one set of documents from that inventory was quietly redirected before the estate review concluded. Redirected by you, by someone acting on my behalf. She stood up and they were facing each other across the narrow table, and the fire was doing its work in the background, and she felt the specific heat of a conversation reaching the edge of what politeness can usefully contain. You have been in my family's business for longer than I knew, she said. Her voice was level, but there was an edge in it, deliberate. The kind of edge you put on something when you want the other person to feel it without being able to accuse you of aggression. You pulled documents from my mother's estate before I had access to them. You tracked my bloodline for 2 years. You sent riders to intercept me on the day I was expelled from a southern court that apparently had no legitimate grounds for expelling me. She paused. I want to know if you see how that looks. I see exactly how that looks, Kaelin said. And I did all of it, he said, because the alternative was leaving you in a situation where someone with worse intentions than mine got to you first. The Eastern interests that fed information to Dareth's court didn't do it to dissolve a political bond. They did it to remove you from a position of influence before you understood what position you actually held. He held her gaze with the steady quality of someone who has stopped trying to seem like less than they are. I moved first. I moved for my own reasons as well as yours. I won't pretend otherwise, but if I had moved differently, you would have gone east and spent the next 3 years in your family seat, while people who know what you are arrange the rest of your life without your knowledge. The fire, the maps on the walls, the weight of 11 years of a man running an empire alone, visible in the set of his jaw, and the stone dust still marking his hands. Seris looked at him. The honest thing, the thing that cost something to admit, was that he wasn't wrong. She could feel it with the same instinct that had made her read that genealogical history 4 years ago, the same instinct that had made her write that margin note, the same instinct that had been quietly, consistently pointing her toward a north she hadn't known to name. I want access to everything, she said. Every document, every record, the archive, my mother's collection, and whatever you've built on top of it in 2 years of tracking my bloodline. You'll have it. I want to draw my own conclusions. I expect nothing less. And if my conclusions tell me that something you've done here is wrong, she let that sit for a half second. I'll tell you. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't fully read. It occupied the space between recognition and something rawer than recognition. "Good," he said. She had expected him to say that she would be listened to, or that her concerns would be considered, or some version of the managed language that powerful men use to acknowledge dissent while containing it. She hadn't expected that single word delivered with apparent sincerity. "Good," she said. "You'll be more useful with conclusions that are yours than with conclusions that are mine handed to you through better presentation." She studied him. Usefulness. He had said useful, not safe, not comfortable, not politically convenient. Useful. There is a particular thing that happens when someone in power tells you the honest version of what they want from you instead of the flattering one. It is more unsettling than flattery because it requires you to decide what you think of the honest version without the buffer of performance to react to. Flattery tells you who someone wants you to think they are. Honesty tells you who they actually are, and then you have to figure out what to do with that. Seris decided she'd figure it out in the archive. Corin came for her 2 hours later, after she had eaten and changed and stood for 20 minutes in the chamber they had given her, larger than expected, north-facing windows with a view of mountain ridgeline and a sky going dark with early winter, shelves along 2 walls already carrying the organization of someone who had thought about what she might need, rather than what would look impressive for a guest. Her mother's documents were on the left shelf. She recognized the leather bindings. She touched one and didn't open it yet. The archive was 2 levels below ground, cut into the mountain's base, the temperature dropping noticeably with each step as the stairs descended into the kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with depth. Iron brackets held oil lamps at consistent intervals. The walls down here were rougher than the upper levels, the mountain speaking more directly through them. Corin stopped at a door. Iron. Old. 3 locks, all currently open. "Third vault is at the back," he said. "I'll wait outside." "The key to the 3rd vault," she said. He looked at her. "Corin." She kept her voice even. "The 3rd vault will have its own lock. Give me the key." His Majesty's instruction was to bring you here, and His Majesty told me I would have access to everything. Give me the key. A beat. Corin reached into his coat and produced a key. She looked at it. A specific iron key, old manufacture, the kind of key that had been made for a specific lock centuries ago by someone who understood that certain things required more than standard security. "This key was removed from its lock 3 days ago," she said. Corin's expression did something involuntary. The thing faces do when a person says something that surprises them before they can decide how to handle the surprise. "My lady, who had access to this key in the last 3 days?" He said nothing, which was an answer. "Who," she said again, "had access?" "That," said a voice behind her, "is the question I've been working on." She turned. Kalen was at the bottom of the stairs. He had changed his coat but still had stone dust on one hand, which she found herself cataloging as a data point. He had washed one hand and not the other, which meant he had been pulled away from something mid-task to come down here. He looked at the key in her hand. "You told him to give it to me," she said. "I told Corin to give you access to the archive. I expected you to ask for the key directly." Something in his voice was tight in a way the upper floor conversation hadn't been. "You were faster than I anticipated." "The key was missing from its lock," she said. "You knew?" "I knew." "Why didn't you tell me when we were talking above?" "Because I didn't know if you were ready for the scale of what the missing key means." She looked at him steadily. "Try me," she said. A long pause. The archive breathed cold around them, centuries of record and memory compressed into this underground space, the specific silence of stored knowledge. "Someone inside this fortress," Kalen said, "accessed the 3rd vault 3 days ago. The 3rd vault is where the founding compact of Varynth is kept, the original document establishing sovereign succession and bloodline rights. If that document has been altered—" He stopped. "If it's been altered," Seris said quietly, "then regardless of what I actually am, there's no legal foundation for whatever claim you brought me here to establish." "Yes." She looked at the door. "So we're going in there to find out," she said. "Yes." She moved toward the door and pushed it open, and the smell hit her first. Old paper, old leather, the particular dry cold of preserved records, and she walked through with the key in her hand and Kaelin a step behind her and the third vault at the back of the room, waiting with whatever truth or destruction it held inside. She found it. Third vault. Small. Iron-faced. The lock showed fresh scratches around its edge, barely visible in the lamplight, the kind of marks that appear when someone uses a key that isn't quite matched to the lock, a copy rather than the original. She fit her key. The lock turned. The vault opened. She reached in and withdrew the founding compact. Thick vellum, ancient, the old language covering its surface in dark ink that had not faded because whoever had made this had made it with permanence in mind. Her hands were steady. She carried it to the reading table, set it flat, and leaned over it in the lamplight. And there it was. Not altered, not destroyed, but a page was missing. Not torn, cut with precision along the binding, so cleanly that if you weren't looking for it, you might not notice until the light caught the edge. One page. She looked up. Kaelin was watching her face. "What was on that page?" she said. His jaw tightened. "The secondary succession clause," he said. "The one that establishes what happens to the sovereign bloodline claim if the primary heir dies without issue." "Without issue," she repeated, "meaning without children?" "Yes." She looked at the cut edge of the missing page. "Kaelin." She said his name directly, without title, and watched him register it without retreating from it. "Are you the primary heir?" He didn't answer immediately. And in that non-answer, in the specific weight of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long deciding whether to put it down, Seris Vaelor understood. The founding compact of Varynth established sovereign succession through bloodline, the primary heir's line. And if the primary heir died without children, the claim moved. "You're not well," she said. Not a question. The way he was standing, the tightness in his jaw that wasn't anger but something he was managing, the stone dust on one hand because he had been pulled away mid-task, yes, but also because he had been doing physical labor again, the same compulsive engagement with physical work she'd noticed since her arrival, the kind that men with restless pain use to keep from being still. "I'm functional," he said. "That's not what I asked." "No," he said, "it isn't." The lamplight in the vault was very still. "How long?" she said. Kaelin looked at the cut edge of the missing page for a long moment, and then he looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived in Varynth, the control that held his face in its practiced evenness slipped. Not much. Just enough. "Long enough," he said, "that whoever took that page already knows the answer." And the cold of the archive pressed in around them, and the empire above breathed its night breath through the stone, and Seris understood with absolute clarity that she had not been brought here simply because of what was in her blood. She had been brought here because someone was already making arrangements for what would happen when the king ran out of time. And the person who had cut the page from the founding compact was somewhere above them right now, inside the walls of Varynth, watching, waiting. And they had known about Seris long enough to move against her before she knew she existed in this story, which meant they were not reacting to her arrival. They had been preparing for it. The missing page had a name on it, not a name on the page itself. The page was gone, cut clean from the binding with the precision of someone who understood that destruction is most effective when it looks like absence rather than violence. The name was on the registration ledger that Seris found in the back of the third vault, a secondary record that cataloged every document in the founding compact by section and content, maintained by whoever served as archive keeper, and updated in a hand that had changed 7 times over the centuries. She found the entry for the missing page in 40 minutes. Kaelin watched her work. She didn't ask him to help, and he didn't offer, which was the right instinct from both of them. She needed to locate this herself, needed the path of her own reasoning rather than his, because at this point the question of who she could trust with her conclusions was still very much open. She was aware of this without hostility. It was simply the correct operational posture for a woman who had been inserted into a situation 3 days ago that other people had been building for years. The ledger entry read, "Secondary succession, bloodline provisions, Vaelor maternal convergence." She read it twice. Then she read the entry below it, which listed the archive keeper responsible for the section's maintenance. Warden Aldrich Hest, appointed year 7 of the Draven Rule. She set the ledger down. "Aldrich Hest, she said. The change in Kaelin was immediate and physical. Not dramatic, nothing that would read as theater, but the particular compression of a man's body when something lands that the mind was already preparing for but the chest wasn't. He said nothing for 3 seconds. He's been with you since year 7, she said. 4 years. He has archive access. He knows the records well enough to identify exactly which page to remove and to know that a copy of the key existed. She paused. He knew about my bloodline because he was the one cataloging it, and he had 4 years to decide what to do with that knowledge. Aldrich, Kaelin said, and the word came out flat, scraped clean of everything except the fact of itself. There is a specific quality to betrayal by proximity. It is categorically different from betrayal by enemies, which carries its own brutality but also a comprehensible logic. Enemies act from opposition, from competition, from fear or ambition aimed at you from the outside. Betrayal by proximity carries no such clean logic. It arrives from inside the perimeter you believed was held, from the space where you lowered your guard because the person occupying it had earned that lowering. It doesn't just damage the present situation. It retroactively reconstructs the past, forcing you to re-examine every interaction, every confidence extended, every moment of apparent loyalty now visible as potential performance. For a man who had ruled alone for 11 years and built the architecture of his authority partly on knowing who to trust, this was not merely a political problem. It was a structural collapse of self-knowledge. Kaelin moved to the door of the vault without haste and without visible emotion, which was more frightening, Seris thought, than either rage or distress would have been. He had the look of someone who had moved past the feeling entirely and arrived somewhere operational, the cold, functional place where decisions get made when the alternative is standing in the rubble and not moving. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. He stopped. "I am not staying in the archive vault while you go handle this alone," she said. "Whatever Hess did, he did it partly in relation to me. That makes it my situation as well as yours. It makes it dangerous," he said. "I know what danger feels like," she said. "I've been living adjacent to it for 6 years in a court full of people who smiled at me while building a case against my bloodline. At least here, the danger has the courtesy to show its face." Something moved in Kaelin's expression. Not quite respect. That was already there, had been since the courtyard. Something more specific. The look of a man recalibrating what he thought he was dealing with. "Close the vault," he said. "Bring the ledger." She locked it and followed him up. Aldrich Hest had chambers on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, which was the archive keeper's traditional residence, close to the records, removed from the main household traffic, the kind of placement that accumulates its own privacy simply by being out of the natural flow of the fortress. Seris had not walked this corridor yet. It was older than the main wings, the stone more irregular, the oil lamps spaced further apart. A section of the fortress that had been built before Varynth became an empire, and still carried the bones of what it had been before. Kaelin knocked. The sound of it was precise. Not police summons heavy or social visit light. Something in between that carried authority without announcement. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. He tried the door. Unlocked. Pushed it open. The room was empty in the particular way of a room that has been emptied rather than simply unoccupied. Drawers left open, a chair at an odd angle, a cup of something on the desk that was still faintly warm when Seris touched it. The desk's surface was clear, not the casual clear of someone's workspace at rest, the deliberate clear of someone who has removed what they didn't want found. Kaelin stood in the center of the room and looked at it. Seris watched him process it. Here is what power does to men over time, and why the story of kings is so often the story of increasing isolation. Authority, real authority, the kind that carries weight and consequence, requires a person to present certainty even in the presence of uncertainty. Every day, in 100 small decisions and a handful of large ones, a ruler must perform confidence because confidence is structurally necessary. It maintains the trust of advisors, the steadiness of military command, the coherence of a court's function. Doubt is expensive at scale. A king who is visibly uncertain creates an environment where his people's certainty begins to erode, and so they learn to contain it. They learn to process their damage privately, to surface only the functional conclusions, to hold the full weight of betrayal and loss and exhaustion somewhere below the public waterline. They become very good at this. So good that over time the containment begins to feel like the actual self, and the things being contained begin to feel like weakness rather than humanity. And eventually you have a man who has not let anyone close enough to observe his damage in years, because proximity is where damage becomes visible. Kaelin had been doing this for 11 years. She could see it in the way he stood in that room, in the absolute stillness of him, in the way his jaw held and his hands stayed loose at his sides, while his eyes moved across the cleared desk with the focus of someone cataloging what was no longer there. He was doing it right now. The containment, the function. He went east, Kaelin said. Yes, he had a head start. He knew we'd be in the archive. He moved to the desk, opened the single drawer left in it. Empty. He's had this ready. For how long? Long enough. He closed the drawer. He was waiting for you to arrive. Your arrival was the signal that events had moved past the stage where having an inside position was more valuable than using what the inside position had gathered. Seris set the ledger on the desk. He gave the Eastern interests your succession documents and my bloodline information, she said. What do they want with it? The secondary succession clause establishes that if the Draven line ends without issue, the sovereign claim of Varynth reverts to the original founding bloodline, the Vaelor maternal line. He looked at her directly. If I die without children and you don't exist as a recognized heir, the throne is contested. If the throne is contested, the Eastern territories file a claim based on proximity and military presence. They've been building that military presence for 3 months. The border testing. Not testing, he said, and the correction carried something that hadn't been in his voice in the vault below, something that sounded like the final piece of a picture he had been assembling and hadn't wanted to finish. Positioning. The room was very quiet. Seris absorbed this. The architecture of it was clean in the way that only well-constructed plans are clean, each element supporting the others, each action calibrated to the whole, no wasted motion. Find the bloodline heir. Isolate her through a proxy action in the south. Remove the legal foundation that would establish her claim in the north. Position military force to contest the resulting vacuum. And have someone inside the fortress to monitor progress and accelerate the timeline if needed. How long have you known you were sick? She asked. He looked at her. Since the autumn before last, he said. 18 months. He had been carrying this for 18 months. And the Eastern interests know. Someone told them. Hest, most likely, or whoever Hest was reporting to. It's the kind of information that changes a 3-year plan into a 6-month plan. Because they needed to move before you either found a successor or recovered. Yes, she looked at the cleared desk, at the empty room, at the man standing in it who had been running an empire alone on borrowed time and had reached, apparently, the moment where running alone was no longer a viable operational strategy. You should have told me all of this from the beginning, she said. I told you what I could verify, he said. I didn't have confirmation on Hest until 5 minutes ago. I don't mean Hest, I mean the illness. The pause was long. That, he said, is not information I give people. I know, she said. I'm telling you that was the wrong call. Something tightened in his face. Not anger, something more honest than anger. The particular tightness of a person hearing a thing they already know is true and finding it no less uncomfortable for knowing it. I needed you to come here for your own reasons, he said. Not out of pity for mine. That's not your decision to make, she said. What I do and why I do it is not something you control by managing what I know. The only thing you accomplished by withholding the illness was making me trust you less when I found out, which I was always going to find out. He didn't answer. Which was, she was learning what Kaelin Draven did when he was processing something he didn't have an argument against. We need to find Hest, she said, and we need to find whoever gave him his instructions, because Hest is competent enough to maintain an inside position for 4 years, but he is not the architect of something this structured. He was a mechanism, not the design. Agreed. And I need to know, she said, exactly what your condition is, what treatment exists, and what the real timeline looks like. Not what you've been telling people. What's actually true. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the next corridor threw its light through the open doorway. The east wing was cold, the heating less efficient in this older section, and she could see his breath faintly when he exhaled. In the morning, he said. I'll tell you everything in the morning. Tonight, she said. A pause. Tonight, he said. She had not anticipated how much that single yielded word would cost him. It was visible, briefly, in the way he said it. Not defeat exactly, but the particular quality of a man releasing something he had gripped for so long that letting go felt like loss even when it was the correct action. They went to the study on the upper floor. The room she had not yet been in but recognized immediately as the room where Kaelin Draven actually lived, not the receiving room with its diplomatic furniture and cartographic precision, but the space where a person puts the things that matter when no one is performing anything. Maps here too, but personal ones, annotated in multiple layers of ink representing different periods of thought. A reading chair worn to the specific shape of him. Books pulled and replaced without ceremony, spines cracked, margins used. A cold cup of something on the corner of a desk covered in active work. This was the room where 11 years of ruling alone had left its actual fingerprints. He added wood to the fire. Did it himself, which told her again what she'd been noting since the courtyard. He was not a king who had outsourced his physical relationship with his own space. It was part of how he stayed sane, probably. The small insistence on handling things directly, on keeping the body engaged with reality when the mind spent most of its time in the altitude of governance where everything is abstracted into consequence and strategy. He sat. She sat across from him. And he told her, the illness was in his blood. Not dramatic in its early presentation, not the kind of thing that announces itself with sudden collapse. It announced itself with fatigue that didn't respond to rest, with a particular ache in the long bones, with the gradual sense of a system running at reduced efficiency rather than failing outright. His physician had identified it 14 months into the deterioration, which meant 4 months of symptoms before a name was attached to them. The name was not a death sentence, strictly. It was a pressure, a progressive condition that could be managed, potentially stabilized, with treatment that was available but not guaranteed, and required a consistency and a physical stillness that 11 years of running an empire on controlled adrenaline had not built in him. He had been managing it alone, adjusting his schedule around the bad days, maintaining the performance of full function because full function was what the empire required, and the empire did not have a succession structure that accommodated a king at reduced capacity. Until now. Seris listened to all of it. She did not respond with pity. She could feel the thing in her chest that wanted to, the genuine human response to someone finally putting down a weight they should never have been carrying alone. But pity was not what he needed, and pity was not what this situation required. What it required was assessment. The Eastern interests know the rough timeline, she said when he finished. Yes, and with Hest gone east, they now know that you know they know. Which means the 6-month plan just became faster. Yes. How fast? If I were running their operation, he said, I would move within the month. Before I can establish your claim legally, before I can rebuild the succession foundation with the missing page reconstructed, before the tribunal has been formally notified of your status. The Imperial Tribunal, she said, Chancellor Vera Sol. She's already been notified of your arrival. The tribunal will come. The question is whether they come on our timeline or on the Eastern Interests timeline. Seris stood and moved to the window. The mountain dark outside was absolute. No city light at this altitude, only star-heavy sky and the shapes of peaks holding the horizon. She could see, barely, the lights of the outer wall sentinels moving in their rotation. Tell me about Chancellor Vera, she said. Competent, procedurally rigorous to the edge of weaponizing procedure. Not corrupt in the traditional sense. She doesn't accept payments or favors for specific outcomes, but she has an institutional bias towards stability over justice, which means she can be moved by the appearance of legal solidity even when the substance is manufactured, like a well-constructed falsified bloodline record. Yes. So if the Eastern interests reach her with their version before we reach her with ours, she will proceed on what she has, Kaelin said, not maliciously, procedurally. She will see documentation, she will see military positioning that suggests an established claim, and she will weight the evidence in favor of the party that presented the cleaner legal case. Seris absorbed this. Then she turned from the window. I need to write a letter tonight, she said, to the Vaelor family archive. There are records there, originals, that predate the falsified dissolution documents by decades. If we can get those records to the tribunal before the Eastern case is presented, It complicates their procedure. The Eastern interests control the route between here and the Vaelor seat. Not all of it. Enough of it. Then we find a messenger who doesn't use the controlled route. She moved to the desk, looked at the materials on it. Do you have someone like that? He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize. The specific quality of a man who had spent years making decisions alone and was in the process of discovering what it felt like to think alongside someone rather than in front of them. It was not a comfortable discovery. Men who have built their competence around solitary function do not find collaboration natural, even when they can see its value. Every instinct built over 11 years of single decision authority pushed against the simple act of including another mind in the working. But he was looking at her, and the look was honest. Yes, he said, I have someone. Then we work tonight, she said. Not tomorrow, tonight. He nodded. She pulled a chair to the desk. He moved to the second chair without hesitation, and they worked. The fire went low and he rebuilt it twice, and she drafted 3 versions of the letter before the 4th one said exactly what needed saying in exactly the language that would be legible to the Vaelor archive keeper who had served the family for 30 years and would recognize the specific phrasing she used as genuine. Kaelin read each draft without commentary until she asked for it, and when she asked, he was precise and useful and didn't substitute his preference for hers. At the 2nd hour past midnight, a rider left Varynth through the lower gate carrying the letter in a sealed packet and wearing no insignia. At the 3rd hour, a second development arrived. Corin came to the study door. His face carried the particular controlled tension of a professional delivering information he wishes were different. Hest, Corin said. We found him. Where? Kaelin said. Eastern Gate Road, 3 miles out. A pause. He didn't make it past the border marker. The silence that followed was its own kind of statement. The Eastern interests, Seris said. Appears so, Corin said. He was carrying nothing. Whatever documentation he had was taken. Kaelin stood very still. Hest had served him for 4 years, had betrayed him, had been running toward the people he betrayed him for, and those same people had used what he carried and then disposed of him with the clean efficiency of an operation that didn't leave loose mechanisms around once they had served their function. Power without loyalty is just a transaction, and transactions end when the exchange is complete. He told them everything he knew before he ran, Kaelin said. Not a question. Almost certainly, Corin said, which means they know the vault was accessed. They know the ledger was found. They know we identified the missing page, and they know Lady Seris is here and actively engaged with the succession documents. Yes, Corin said. Kaelin looked at Seris. She looked back. Here is what the death of Aldrich Hest meant beyond its immediate political mechanics. It meant the Eastern operation had a ruthlessness calibrated to timelines, not sentiment. It meant whoever was running this had made peace with human cost before the plan began, which meant the plan had been built from the beginning with an absence of the hesitations that slow ordinary ambition down. And it meant that they were not afraid to accelerate. Hest had been meant to monitor. His exposure meant that function was gone, so the operation moved to its next phase. How long until they move? Seris asked. Days, Kaelin said. Not weeks. Then we don't have time for the tribunal to receive our letter and respond through normal channels. No. We need to go to the tribunal directly. If we leave Varynth, if we stay in Varynth while the Eastern case is being presented to Varysol in the capital, we lose the legal ground and we fight from a position of contested legitimacy. She held his gaze. I know you don't want to move. I know your instinct is to hold the fortress and manage from within it. But the empire isn't won by whoever holds their ground longest. It's won by whoever controls the narrative first. He looked at her. She could see the calculation running, could see him examining it from every angle with the thoroughness of a man who had survived 11 years by not acting on incomplete assessments. And she could see, underneath the calculation, something else. The particular unsteadiness of a man whose framework for decision-making had been built on solitude and was being asked to weight another person's judgment as equivalent to his own. It wasn't doubt of her. It was the structural cost of trusting. The way you have to dismantle something that kept you functional in order to build something better. For a king who had been sick and alone and running everything on controlled output, that dismantling was not small. But he was looking at her. And when he spoke, his voice was steady. "How many days do you need to prepare your legal case for presentation to the tribunal?" "1," she said. "1 day," he said. "Then we move." Corin in the doorway said nothing. He had the look of a man who had served this king long enough to know when something fundamental had shifted, and who had the professional wisdom to let it shift without comment. Seris turned back to the desk. There was more work to do before dawn. She had 1 day to build a legal case that would hold against a manufactured opposition that had been preparing for years. 1 day to construct the framework of an argument from records that were incomplete, from a founding compact that was missing its key page, from a bloodline trail that had been deliberately obscured over generations. 1 day. And somewhere in the Eastern Territories, the operation that had been watching her bloodline longer than she had known it mattered was making its own preparations. And somewhere in the capital, Chancellor Varynth was receiving correspondence. And the empire of Varynth, built in obsidian and conviction and the particular will of a man who had held it together through 11 years of attrition, was approaching the moment that all things built on singular strength eventually approach, the moment when the question is no longer whether the builder can hold it, but whether what they've built can hold without them. Seris picked up the pen. She had been thrown away from the life she planned. She had been redirected by a man who needed her for reasons both political and human. She had walked into an obsidian fortress and found, in its archive, the evidence that everything she had been told about her own diminished worth was a lie constructed by people who understood her value better than she had. She had 1 day. She began to write, and the Iron Crown, in the dark of the sealed vault below, waited for the morning with the patience of something that had never doubted the outcome, only the cost. The case was built by dawn, not elegant, not the kind of legal architecture that gets constructed over months with teams of scribes and advisors working in comfortable rooms with full access to clean records. This was emergency construction, the kind of work that gets done when the alternative is losing everything, when you take what you have and you build with it hard and fast, and you make the gaps into arguments rather than letting them be weaknesses. Seris had worked through the night at Kaelin's desk while he worked beside her, and somewhere in the 4th hour she had stopped being aware of him as a separate presence and started experiencing him the way you experience a person who has synced to your rhythm. Not lost in each other, nothing soft about it, but the particular functional intimacy of two minds working the same problem from different angles and beginning to anticipate where the other is going before they say it. He knew the legal precedents. She knew the bloodline documentation. He knew the tribunal's procedural vulnerabilities. She knew the specific language that the founding compact used in the sections that remained, and she had a memory precise enough to reconstruct the logical argument that the missing page had contained based on the sections surrounding it. You do not need the page if you can prove what the page must have said. That was the core of it. By the time gray light started doing something cautious at the study windows, she had a document that would hold. Not comfortably. Not with the padding of uncontested evidence and cooperative witnesses and the advantage of preparation, but it would hold under scrutiny if the person presenting it had the steadiness to stand behind it. She would be the person presenting it. Kaelin looked at the completed draft and said nothing for 2 minutes, reading with the thoroughness she had come to recognize as his actual mode of attention. No skimming, no performance of engagement, genuine processing. The convergence argument in the 3rd section, he said. Vera will push back on it. She'll push back on it and find it holds, Seris said. The convergence is established by the 2 sections on either side of the missing page. She can't attack the gap without attacking the surrounding text, and the surrounding text is original and unaltered. She'll know it holds. She'll know it. She won't like it. She doesn't have to like it, Seris said. She has to recognize it as legally sufficient. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them had slept, and both of them were carrying it. The particular rawness of a long night's work in a cold room, the kind of exhaustion that strips the face of its managed expressions and leaves something more basic visible. He looked older in this light, or maybe more accurately. He looked his actual age rather than the controlled presentation of it, and there was something about that which was more substantial to her than any version of him that had been composed for an audience. She stood and stretched her back and did not think about how she looked doing it because they were past that. I'll need an hour to prepare, she said. Then we leave. 2 hours, he said. I have arrangements to make for the fortress's security in my absence. 1.5, she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but the territory where a smile would live in another man's face moved briefly in his. 1.5, he said. She went to her chambers and washed the night off her face with cold water that bit hard enough to be useful, changed into travel clothes that were dark and practical and carried no southern court softness in their lines, put her hair up with the particular efficiency of someone who had stopped using her appearance as a performance and started using it as a statement. She looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her documents and went to find her horse. The convoy that left Varynth at mid-morning was not large. Kaelin had made this decision deliberately. A large escort announced itself, invited attention, gave the eastern operation something visible to intercept or use as evidence of military posturing before the tribunal. 12 riders, Corin at the lead, Seris and Kaelin at the center. Enough to manage a genuine threat, not enough to look like an army moving on the capital. The road south was different traveled in this direction. Seris had come north in the particular suspension of a person moving toward an unknown. She was moving south now in the specific tension of a person moving toward a confrontation whose terms were partially set by other people and whose outcome was not guaranteed. The mountain road that had seemed austere and honest on the way up felt urgent on the way down. The altitude dropping in increments that the body registered as increasing pressure, the warmth building slowly as the elevation fell. The sky going from the blue-gray of high cold to something lower and more complicated. Kaelin rode beside her. They did not talk much in the first hours, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had already said most of what needed saying, and what remained was the specific silence of people who have been honest with each other in the dark, and are now carrying that honesty into daylight, where it looks different and requires different management. At the second hour, the rider at the rear came forward to report what Corin had already signaled from the front, dust on the eastern ridge road. Moving parallel. How many? Kaelin said. Can't count yet, the rear rider said. Enough to raise that much dust. Seris looked east. The ridge road was visible as a pale line against darker terrain, the kind of road that existed for territory access rather than commerce, built for function, not frequency. The dust cloud was not small. They were waiting for us to move, she said. Yes, Kaelin said. They couldn't take the fortress, but they can intercept the convoy. Yes. So our letter was either intercepted before the rider got through, or they don't care about the letter because they plan to reach Vera before we do regardless. The second, he said. If they had the letter, we'd know in a different way. They're moving to the capital directly. She looked at the road ahead. The capital was 3 days' travel at normal pace. A hard push could do it in 2, but hard pushes across mountain descent roads were operationally inadvisable unless the alternative was worse. The eastern force on the ridge road was moving at a pace that suggested they had calculated this already. They'll reach the capital before us, she said. With their documentation. Yes. Then we need to not let them. Kaelin turned to look at her. What you're suggesting? I'm suggesting we ride harder, she said. I'm suggesting we push, and we don't stop for comfort, and we get there before they do, or we get there the same time they do, which is not ideal but is better than arriving after. The condition of the road, I know the condition of the road, she said. I came up it 3 days ago. I know exactly what it asks of a horse and a rider. I'm telling you I can do it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Corin. Hard pace, he said. Corin didn't hesitate. The convoy pushed. Here is what hard travel does to the body and to the mind that lives inside it. It simplifies. The complications of strategy and politics and the long architecture of human betrayal compress themselves into the immediate and physical. The horse under you, the road ahead, the ache building in your lower back and your inner thighs. The cold air hitting your face at a pace that makes it feel less like weather and more like resistance. Your mind stops living in the future and starts living in the next 10 minutes, the next hill, the next visible stretch of road. There is a kind of clarity in that. Not pleasant, not comfortable, but honest in the way that only things stripped of excess ever become. You discover in those hours what is actually essential in you. Not what you perform, not what you've constructed through years of careful presentation, but what remains when presentation is not possible because you're too focused on staying on the horse. What remained in Seris, pushed hard down a mountain road with an unknown force moving parallel on the ridge, was something she could only describe as certainty, not confidence, which is the pleasant cousin of certainty. certainty itself. The cold, specific knowledge of a person who has finally located the ground beneath them after years of walking on other people's constructed floors. She had not chosen this. She had been thrown from one life and redirected to another. But somewhere between the archive vault and the dawn desk work, and the particular quality of a man telling her the truth about his failing body in a room full of books he'd actually read, she had stopped experiencing Varynth as something that had been arranged around her and started experiencing it as something she was choosing. That shift was not small. It changed the quality of everything. The convoy rode hard for 6 hours before Corin signaled the stop at a way station in the lower foothills. The horses needed water in 20 minutes. The riders needed less than that and took more only because a burned-out escort was an operational liability. Seris dismounted, walked out the stiffness in her legs, ate something without tasting it, drank cold water from the station cistern. Kaelin was at the far edge of the station yard talking to Corin in a low voice. She watched him without appearing to. He was moving carefully, not dramatically, nothing that would read as distress from a distance, but the particular economy of someone managing physical discomfort by minimizing the movements that aggravated it. Bad day. She filed it and didn't approach. He would tell her if it became operationally relevant. If he didn't, she would notice it herself. Either way, she was not going to add to his load by making him manage her concern on top of everything else. The eastern ridge dust had not been visible for the last hour of the descent, which meant either they had stopped or they had taken a different line that wasn't visible from the road. The second option was more likely and more concerning. If they knew a faster route, Corin came to her. They split, he said. We got word from a rider we passed. A column of about 30 turned west at the Bren Junction 2 hours back. The rest continued south. She thought about this. 30 west, she said. West toward what? The Bren Junction gives access to the pass road, Corin said. The pass road connects to the capital from the north rather than the mountain approach. It's longer in distance but flatter. Faster overall? If they push, and they're pushing. She found Kaelin. They split the force, she said. He had already heard it. His face was doing the calculation she recognized from the archive and the study. The thorough working of variables, not rushed, each element given its weight. The smaller group is a flanking action, he said. They put 30 riders on the pass road, which will bring them into the capital ahead of us. The main body stays on the eastern road as a show of force when the tribunal convenes. He paused. They've thought this through. Who is at the center of this? She said. Not Hest, not even the operations field commanders. Who built this? Lord Savar Kane, Kaelin said. Eastern Territorial Governor for 9 years, patient, methodical. He doesn't make visible moves. He makes invisible ones and waits for them to compound. He knew about your condition. He knew before I confirmed it, which means either he had a source inside my physician's household or Hest had access to my personal correspondence. And Kane's legal claim to the throne in the event of your death? Distant, procedural. The kind of claim that only becomes viable when there are no legitimate heirs and the tribunal is working from incomplete information and has someone standing in front of them with organized documentation and military backing. So, if we don't arrive before his people present their case, Kaelin said, then what Vera sees is a well-documented succession claim, an absence of the contested party, and a force positioned outside the capital that makes the question of what happens if she rules the wrong way impossible to ignore. Seris looked at the road south. Then we don't let that happen, she said. There are 30 riders ahead of us on the pass road. I know. Seris. She looked at him. He said her name differently than he had at the beginning. Not the formal address of first introduction, not the careful professional designation of a king managing a political asset. Just her name, in the voice of a man speaking directly to the person he meant. I brought you here, he said, into this. I brought you into the middle of a war I didn't fully explain. You told me the truth when I pushed for it, she said. That's more than most people manage. It's not enough. It is for now, she said. We can do the rest of this accounting later, when we're not racing 30 armed riders to the capital. Something moved in his face, that not quite smile territory again. But this time it resolved into something more complete, brief, honest, the kind of expression that lives in a face that has forgotten how to perform it. Mount up, he said. They rode. The pass road junction came 2 hours later and they turned onto it without slowing, the horses pushing through the flatter terrain at the pace that flat terrain allows after mountain descent. The sky going gray above them in the specific way of late afternoon in northern winter. The light not dying but compressing, everything becoming sharper edged and less forgiving as the day committed to its ending. Corrin's outriders came back with the first contact report at the 3rd hour on the pass road. Riders visible ahead, blocking. Not ambush. The positioning was too deliberate for ambush. Ambush requires concealment, and what the outriders described was open placement across the road, a line of riders making themselves visible, which meant they wanted to be seen. They wanted the stop. They wanted the conversation, or the confrontation. Kaelin took the report from Corrin with the evenness she had come to understand was not coldness, but the specific discipline of a man who had decided long ago that visible agitation in a leader costs everyone around him something they can't afford. "How many?" he said. 22 visible, Corrin said. "There'll be others positioned off-road. So they're 30 split into a blocking force and a fast group that's already past us and moving to the capital." "That's what it looks like." Kaelin turned to Seris. She was already looking at the road ahead, at the faint line of riders barely visible at the limit of afternoon light. Here's the thing about this moment, and it is worth pausing on because it is the kind of moment that reveals something essential about what humans become when power and survival and genuine conviction collide. 22 riders blocking a road does not look like a philosophical problem. It looks like an obstacle, a threat, a practical challenge requiring a practical response. And yet underneath the immediate tactical reality, this moment is the distillation of everything the last 4 days had built toward. It is the moment where the story that Seris Vaelor was telling about herself, the story of a woman discarded and redirected, finding the ground of her own legitimacy, collides with the story that other people had been writing for her. Every person who has ever been underestimated reaches this moment. The moment where the world that did the underestimating shows its face and says, "We are still here, we still hold the ground, what are you going to do about it?" What you do in that moment is not just strategy, it is character. "We don't stop," Seris said. Kaelin looked at her. "They're blocking the road," Corrin said. "My lady." "They're blocking the road to create a delay," she said. "Every hour they hold us here, the group ahead of them gets closer to the capital and Varysol hears their version. The block is not meant to stop us, it's meant to slow us, which means the one thing we cannot give them is time." "There are 22 of them," Corrin said. "With probably 12 more off-road," she said. 34, against 12. She looked at Kaelin. "You know this road? Is there another way around them?" "Not in time," he said. "Then we go through." "Seris, I am not asking for permission," she said, and the directness of it landed in the cold air between them. Not as aggression, but as absolute clarity. The voice of a person who has finished letting the geometry of other people's choices determine her own. "I am the blood heir of this empire under the founding compact of Varynth, and those riders are blocking my road. Tell me what we need to do." Kaelin was very still for 1 second. Then he looked at Corrin. "Formation," he said. What happened in the next 20 minutes lived outside the frame of anything Seris had experienced in 6 years of Southern court life, outside the frame of anything her father's careful Northern lessons had prepared her for directly, inside the frame of something older, the part of a human being that exists beneath the socialization, beneath the composure, beneath the years of learning to present a managed surface to a world that rewards management. The riders moved into the formation Kaelin designated. Tight, functional, Seris and Kaelin at the protected center. Not because she needed protection in the passive sense, but because they were both more valuable to the outcome of the next 3 days alive than dead. And that was a practical reality, not a condescension. The blocked riders saw them coming and the line tightened. Corrin's lead riders did not slow. The collision of wills happened at a pace that compressed time into something narrower than its usual measure. The shouting of the Eastern riders, the demand to halt, the counter-assertion of Corrin's voice cutting back at them without particular drama, the specific chaos of 30-plus horses in close proximity, each responding to the fear and aggression moving through the air like weather. 3 Eastern riders came directly at the center. Kaelin moved. She had not seen him fight before. She had seen him work. The stone dust on his hands, the physical relationship with his own fortress, The deliberate engagement of the body as a counter to the altitude of governance. She had read in him the specificity of a man who maintained capability not as display but as function. What she saw in those 3 minutes was the difference between a man who is trained to fight and a man who has fought. He was controlled in the way that expensive precision is controlled. Not flashy, nothing wasted, every movement committed to its purpose, and finished before the next one began. He was also, visibly, managing something in his body that wanted to interfere, some signal from the system that was failing him, asking for what couldn't be given right now, and the act of overriding it was visible if you knew what to look for. She knew what to look for. She also, in those 3 minutes, held her own against a rider who came at the center with less respect for her than the situation warranted, and corrected that underestimation with the kind of cold efficiency that comes from 6 years of invisible preparation and 3 days of understanding exactly what she was fighting for. He came off his horse. She did not. The Eastern blocking force was not prepared for opponents who didn't slow and didn't negotiate, and had already committed to the cost of going through. Professional soldiers can be brave and competent, and still be fundamentally unprepared for the particular quality of people who have nothing to lose in the conventional sense, people for whom the negotiated outcome is already gone, and what remains is the thing underneath the negotiation. Seris and Kaelin and what remained of the escort broke through in the kind of disordered forward motion that isn't victory exactly, but is forward, which was the only thing that mattered. 3 of their 12 were down. She did not look back. You cannot look back when looking back costs ground. The road opened up ahead of them, and the capital's outer lights were visible on the horizon as the day completed its compression into dark. And Corin was riding hard, and Kaelin was riding hard, and she was riding with the full weight of her body and her intention, and every year she had spent being careful in service of a future that had been built on false ground. This future was not false. This one was hers. The capital gates at night were administered by tribunal security rather than local authority, a jurisdictional fact that Kaelin had mentioned during the dawn work in the study, and that now became relevant in the specific way of a detail that seemed procedural until it wasn't. The tribunal's standard practice was to admit arriving parties regardless of hour, when the arriving party held appropriate authority, and Kaelin Draven's authority at the capital gates was not disputed. They were admitted. The tribunal's administrative hall was in the eastern quarter of the capital, a large stone building that had been doing the work of imperial legal function for 60 years and wore that function in its architecture. Serious, plain, built for process rather than ceremony. Lights burned in 3 of its upper windows despite the hour. Corin went ahead. "Vera's inside, bus," he reported back in 4 minutes, "with company." "Whose company?" Kaelin said. "A delegation. 6 people. Eastern territorial insignia." Seris looked at Kaelin. The 30 riders had split their fast group further, some to block, some to arrive ahead. The people currently inside with Varynth had been traveling without the combat engagement that had cost Seris and Kaelin their 3 hours, which meant they had arrived with their documentation clean and their composure intact, and the particular advantage of a party that gets to set the first narrative. "How long have they been inside?" she said. "An hour," Corin said. 1 hour. Long enough. She dismounted. She smoothed her coat, which was road dirty and carried on one sleeve evidence of the blocked road encounter that she could not entirely remove. She looked at the documents in her hand, the case she had built through the night, the argument constructed from what remained of the founding compact, the bloodline evidence, the reconstruction of the missing page's logical content. They were sufficient. They were, she knew, sufficient because she had made them sufficient through the hours of night work with a man who had been honest with her and beside her and had trusted her conclusions as his own. And that trust was the thing that made them sufficient, because she had built the argument for herself rather than for him, and that meant it had the particular strength of a person who is not performing conviction but actually has it. She was road dirty. She was tired. She had bruises forming on her left side from the blocked road, and 3 years of Southern court composure stripping away in real time to reveal something raw and more present underneath. Good. Let Varynth see all of it. The truth was not supposed to look pristine. Kaelin came to stand beside her. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He was managing his body with the discipline of someone who had been doing it for 18 months and was not going to stop now, because the situation required that he not stop. But his hand, when she glanced down, showed the faint tremor of someone pushing past what the system wanted to offer. She moved her hand to cover his briefly. Not tenderness, not of the performance of connection for an audience. The specific action of one person telling another that they see what's being managed and the scene is not pity. He went still under her hand for a moment, then steady. She removed her hand. "Ready?" she said. "I've been ready," he said. They walked toward the building. Behind them, the Eastern delegation's horses were still tied at the rail. Well-kept animals, rested, carrying none of the road evidence of a group that had fought their way through a blocked pass. Inside that building, Vaelor was hearing a case. Inside that building, a man named Savar Kane's representatives were presenting documents and precedents and the carefully constructed legal architecture of a plan 9 months in the building. And Seris Vaelor, who had been thrown away from one life and walked into another and found in the dark of an archive vault the name that had been waiting for her for 3 centuries, was walking up the steps with the founding case of her sovereignty in her hands, and 6 years of being underestimated behind her like a loaded weapon, she was finally pointing in the right direction. The door of the tribunal hall was heavy iron and old wood. Corin reached for it. From inside, audible even through the door's weight, a woman's voice, precise, authoritative, the voice of someone who had been doing institutional power for long enough that it came naturally, said something that Seris couldn't quite make out. And another voice responded. A man's voice she didn't recognize, smooth and calibrated, and carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed the room was already his. Corin pulled the door open. The light and warmth of the hall came out into the cold night. Seris stepped forward. The delegation from the Eastern Territories turned to look. Chancellor Vaelor looked up from the document spread before her. And across the chamber, in the chair of the Eastern delegation's lead representative, sat a man she had never seen in person, but whose description she had reconstructed from Kaelin's words in the study. Patient, methodical, the kind who made invisible moves, and who was now very visibly recalculating the value of everything he had spent 9 months building. Lord Savar Kane. He looked at her. She looked back, and she walked into the room with the documents in her hands, and the full weight of what she was standing on visible in every line of her, and the door closed behind her, and the room that had been his for the last hour became contested ground the moment she entered it. "Chancellor Sol," she said, and her voice was level and present and carried no apology for the road dirt or the hour or the bruises forming under her coat. "My name is Seris Vaelor, and I believe you're currently being presented with information that requires significant correction." Vaelor looked at her, then at Kaelin, who had stepped in behind her, then at Savar Kane, whose recalculation had concluded and whose face had settled into the particular stillness of a man who has just realized that the room has changed and who is deciding, right now, in this moment, whether to adapt or to accelerate. He looked at the documents in Seris's hand, then back at her face, and in his eyes, precise, patient, the eyes of a man who had been playing a long game and had played it well and was now watching the final move of the other player arrive. She saw the specific thing that determined how the next hour would go. Not defeat, not retreat, decision. He had 30 riders outside the city who had not yet been stood down. He had documentation that had been in Vaera's hands for an hour. He had a throne that was almost within reach. And he had now the additional factor of a woman standing in his way who had just ridden hard through his blocking force and walked into his most important room with the founding evidence of an empire in her hands and nothing left to lose. His eyes moved to Kaelin. The king of Varynth stood behind the woman he had brought here, and something in Kaelin's face, something quiet and absolute and completely without the performance of threat, said everything that didn't need to be said aloud. Kane's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the front of his coat, and the room, in the space between one breath and the next, reached the moment where everything that had been built over months of invisible architecture would collapse or hold, depending on what happened in the next 30 seconds. Seris did not look away from him. She stood her ground, and she waited. Kane's hand stopped moving, not because he had decided against whatever the hand had been moving toward, because Vaera's soul stood up. She did it without ceremony, without drama, the way a person stands when they have been sitting for too long in a room that has been going in the wrong direction and have decided, with the full authority of their position, that the direction is about to change. She was smaller than Seris had imagined from Kaelin's description, compact, somewhere in her 6th decade, with the particular physical economy of a woman who had spent 40 years in rooms full of men who underestimated her and had long since stopped expending energy on the performance of taking up space. Her hair was silver and pinned back without ornament. Her coat was the dark green of tribunal authority. She looked at Kane's hand, then at Kane. "Lord Kane," she said, and her voice carried the specific temperature of a woman who has decided something. "Whatever is in the front of your coat will remain there." A beat. Kane's hand went back to the arm of the chair. Seris filed this. Vera was not a tool of the Eastern interests, which she had suspected but hadn't confirmed, and confirmation changed the architecture of the next hour in ways that were mostly useful. Vera turned to Seris. She looked at her the way Seris imagined she looked at every document that came before her, with the complete attention of someone who understood that the first impression of a thing was data, not conclusion, and who had trained herself out of the habit of letting first impressions do the work that examination was supposed to do. She looked at the road dirt, at the bruised forearm visible below Seris's pushed-up sleeve, at the documents in her hands. "Lady Vaelor," she said. "Chancellor Sol," Seris said. "You've had a difficult evening." "The road required it," Seris said. "So did the company." She did not look at Kane when she said it. She kept her eyes on Vera, because Vera was the room. Kane was a problem, but Vera was the decision, and there was a significant difference. "I've been presented this evening with a succession claim pertaining to the Varynth throne," Vera said. "The claim cites the absence of legitimate heirs, the deteriorating capacity of the current sovereign, and the procedural standing of Lord Kane's Eastern territorial authority in the event of succession vacancy." "I know," Seris said. "I'd like to present a counter-document." "I imagine you would." Vera extended her hand. Seris crossed the room and placed the document in it. She was aware, walking those 12 steps, of Kane watching her, of the 2 members of his delegation who had shifted in their seats with the precise quality of men recalculating their physical options, of Kaelin standing at the door with Corrin, not moving, not needing to. His presence in the room was its own argument. The King of Varynth standing on his own feet in the tribunal hall, alive and present, and not the diminished figure the Eastern documentation had presumably described. Vera read. She read the way she had looked, completely, without performance, each section receiving its full attention. The room held the silence of people who understood that interrupting this process was not in their interest. Kane said, "Chancellor, the document before you was constructed in less than 48 hours by a woman with an obvious personal interest in its conclusions. The founding compact records in Varynth's archive are inaccessible at this hour for independent verification, and Lord Kane," Vera said without looking up from the document. He stopped. "I will tell you when I want your analysis," she said. He stopped. Seris kept her face neutral. 4 minutes passed. Vera reached the 3rd section, the convergence argument, the one Kaelin had said she would push back on, and her reading slowed. She went back 2 pages, read the surrounding sections again, went forward. The quality of her attention sharpened, which Seris registered as a good sign rather than a threat, because a person who had already decided against you didn't slow down on the hard sections. She finished. She set the document on the table beside Kane's documentation and looked at both of them without touching either. "The missing page," she said to Seris. "Cut from the binding," Seris said. 3 days ago. The archive registration ledger identifies the section and its custodian. The custodian departed Varynth the night of the access and was found dead on the eastern road the following morning. Vera looked at Kane. Kane's face did not change, which was, Seris thought, its own kind of change. "The convergence argument in the 3rd section," Vera said to Seris. "You're reconstructing the content of the missing page from the surrounding text." "Yes," Seris said. "The founding compact structure is internally consistent. The missing page sits between 2 sections that establish the primary succession mechanism and the secondary transfer conditions. The logical content of the bridge between those sections is not ambiguous. It can only say one thing if the surrounding text is to be coherent. That's an inference, Kane said. It's a legal reconstruction, Seris said. Recognized under the Founding Compact's own interpretive protocol, Section 7, which establishes that in the event of document loss or damage, the surrounding text constitutes binding interpretive framework. Section 7 is still in the archive, still original, still unaltered. Kane looked at her. She looked back. And here is what that exchange contained that the room couldn't see. It contained the full weight of what he had built and what she had survived. He had spent 9 months constructing a path to a throne. He had used proxies and forged documents, and a man who had served faithfully for 4 years and then died on a road for his trouble. He had been methodical and patient and genuinely skilled at the kind of invisible architecture that moves power from one set of hands to another without leaving clean fingerprints. And she had arrived at his endgame with a night's work and a bruised arm and a document that was not perfect but was honest. And she was standing in front of the person whose decision mattered, and she was not performing anything. That was what he couldn't account for. He had prepared for opposition. He had prepared for legal counterargument. He had prepared for the political complications of Kaelin's presence and the bloodline evidence and the tribunal's procedural requirements. He had not prepared for someone who had genuinely stopped being afraid. Fear is the thing that makes people manageable, not fear of physical harm. That's the crude version, the blunt instrument. The effective fear is subtler, fear of losing standing, of being diminished, of being seen as less than the performance you've constructed. That fear makes people careful in ways that create exploitable hesitation. It makes them manage their exposure rather than commit fully to what they're doing. Seris had been afraid, in that way, for 6 years. She had managed her exposure in the Crimson Court with a precision that never quite protected her. She had been careful in ways that created their own kind of paralysis. Never fully present, never fully committed, always holding something back for the retreat that never came because the dissolution decree arrived before she needed to plan it. That version of her had ended in the tribunal hall in the capital on a night with road dirt on her coat. What stood in its place was not recklessness, was not the performative fearlessness of someone who has decided to be impressive, was something simpler and harder, a woman who knew what she was standing on. Varynth looked at both documents for a long moment. Then she looked at Kaelin. "Your Majesty," she said, "I will ask you directly in this chamber with full tribunal authority. What is the state of your health and your capacity to govern?" Kaelin stepped forward. He moved the way he always moved, without excess, without performance. But Seris was close enough to see what it cost him tonight, the extra calibration in each step, the jaw carrying something that wasn't visible from across the room. He was standing on will in a way that was not sustainable but was not required to be sustainable, only required to be sufficient for this hour. He stopped 6 feet from Vera's table. "My health is being managed," he said. "My capacity to govern is undiminished. The Eastern documentation characterizing my condition was based on information provided by a now-deceased source who had an interest in its presentation. And the succession," Vera said, "the question of heirs, is resolved," Kaelin said, "by the document Lady Vaelor has placed before you. The bloodline convergence is valid. The legal standing of the Vaelor maternal line under the Founding Compact is established, and the recognition of that standing is a matter I intend to formalize before this tribunal at its next convened session." "Formalize how?" Vera said. A pause, not the pause of uncertainty. The pause of a man choosing words that would not be chosen carelessly because they would not be retracted. "In the manner the Founding Compact specifies for sovereign recognition," he said. "A bonding declaration, witnessed by the tribunal, registered in the imperial record." The room was very still. Seris had not known he would say this tonight. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And in that look, direct, present, carrying no management and no performance, was the answer to the question she had asked him in the study on the first night, the question he had said he would answer later. Why, beyond operational reasons, he had waited. Why, beyond strategy, he had sent riders south. He had not been building a political solution. He had been building toward a person. And he was telling her that in the most public possible way, in the most binding possible language, in front of the one authority whose recognition made it permanent. She had not been consulted. She also, standing in the full honesty of this room on this night, having spent 4 days in the company of a man who had been more truthful with her than anyone in the previous 6 years combined, found that she did not need to have been consulted. She already knew her answer, but she was not going to give it in Kane's presence, in this charged room, as a reactive statement to a declaration that had been used tactically. She was going to give it in her own time, in her own terms, because that was the nature of a choice that was genuinely hers. She looked at Kalen and gave him nothing readable. He understood immediately, which told her something important. He turned back to Vera. "The documentation before you is sufficient for preliminary recognition," he said. "I would ask the Chancellor to acknowledge its standing tonight, pending formal verification of the archive records and the registration ledger." Vera looked at Kane's documentation, then at Seris's. "Lord Kane," she said, "the document you have presented cites the deteriorating capacity of the current sovereign and the absence of established heirs. The sovereign is standing in this room under his own authority. The heir question is addressed by counter-documentation with a stronger legal foundation than your claim. In addition, your primary source is dead under circumstances that this tribunal will be examining." She paused. "What is it precisely that you believe your claim currently rests on?" Kane was quiet for 3 seconds, and then he said something that surprised her. "Nothing," he said. Not bitterly, not with the sharp edge of a man conceding defeat under duress, with the flat evenness of someone who has run a calculation and arrived at its honest conclusion. "The claim rests on nothing," he said, "that this room will recognize tonight." Vera held his gaze. "The riders outside the city," she said. "Will be stood down," he said, "before dawn." "Lord Kane, I am a patient man, Chancellor," he said. "I do not make the mistake of compounding a failed position. Tonight's position has failed." He stood. His 2 delegation members stood with him. "I trust the tribunal will conduct its examination of the archive irregularities with its customary thoroughness." "You can trust that," Vera said. He looked at Seris. She looked back. There are men who lose with the rage of someone who cannot accept the loss. And there are men who lose with the cold calculation of someone already planning the next approach. And there are men who lose by disappearing entirely and waiting for the world to rearrange itself around a new opportunity. She could not yet tell which kind Kane was. She suspected the third. The first type announces itself. The second type argues. The third type stands up quietly and walks to the door. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on it, not theatrically, but in the way of someone who has decided to say one more thing. "Lady Vaelor," he said. She waited. "You were more difficult to remove than anticipated," he said. "I mean that without rancor. It's simply true." She said nothing. He left. The door closed. The room breathed. Vera Saul sat back down and looked at the 2 documents on her table, and then at Seris and Kalen with the expression of a woman who had been running imperial legal function for 30 years and had seen most of what power could produce and was currently processing an evening that had covered more ground than most of her months. "I will acknowledge the preliminary standing of the Vaelor bloodline document," she said, "pending verification, which will be conducted within the fortnight. The tribunal will send a team to Varynth's archive within the week." She looked at Kalen. "Your Majesty's formal declaration will be received at the tribunal's next convened session, which I will schedule for 3 weeks from today." She looked at Seris. "That gives you 3 weeks, Lady Vaelor, to confirm that the declaration is something you want recorded." "I know what I want," Seris said. "Good," Vera said. "Then I will note for the record that both parties were present and ambulatory and in possession of their faculties." She reached for her pen. "Go get some sleep. Both of you look like you need it." They left the tribunal hall into the cold night. The Eastern delegation's horses were still at the rail. Kane's riders were already moving, not aggressively, not with the tension of a force preparing action, but with the specific purposeful motion of an operation standing itself down. Animals being gathered, people redistributing weight toward a retreat that had already been decided. She watched them for a moment. Kalen stood beside her. They had not spoken since his declaration in the hall, not privately, and the space between them carried the weight of everything that had been said publicly and everything that remained to be said between just the 2 of them. She turned to him. He looked at her steadily. "You should have told me before you said it in that room," she said. Yes, he said. I don't make decisions reactively. Not for other people's tactical purposes, and not for my own. I know, he said. Then why? Because I needed to say it when I still had the certainty to say it, he said. And there was something in his voice that was different from every other version of his voice she had heard. Stripped of the governance layer, stripped of the precision, carrying only the honesty that lives underneath when a person is too tired to maintain anything else. Because I have been certain about very few things in 11 years that weren't operational. And this one I needed to say before I found a reason not to. She looked at him. He looked back. The cold air was doing its work around them, and the capital's night sounds were moving in the middle distance, and Kane's people were quietly disappearing from the rail. And this moment, this specific moment between a man who had been running alone for too long and a woman who had spent 6 years being carefully invisible, was not the moment from the story. It was not the ceremony or the declaration or the founding compact's formal language. It was just two people on steps. I know my answer, she said. He waited. But I'm not giving it to you tonight, she said. Tonight we both need sleep, and you need your physician, and I need to write 3 letters, and we both need to eat something that isn't road rations. She held his gaze. You'll have my answer when I give it, and you'll know before I say it. Something in his face shifted. That not quite smile territory, except this time it resolved again, briefly and honestly. How will I know? He said. You'll know, she said, because you've been paying attention. She walked toward the lodging Corin had arranged. She did not look back, but she was aware, with the specific awareness of a person who has finally stopped managing their own perceptions, that she was smiling. 3 weeks. The tribunal verification team arrived at Varynth on the 8th day. 4 people, 2 archivists and 2 legal witnesses, professional and thorough, and entirely without the prejudgment that would have been convenient for either side. They spent 4 days in the archive. They examined the founding compact, the ledger, the cut binding of the missing page. They cross-referenced the registration records with the construction history of the vault. They read the surrounding sections of the founding compact with the specific attention of people for whom the text was not political, only legal. They left without announcement. Their report reached Vera Sol before it reached Varynth. Seris was in the study, Kalen's study, which had become the working room by default, because it contained the right materials and the right table, and because the informal annexation of the space had happened so gradually that neither of them had noted the moment it became shared. When Corin brought the message from the capital, she read it. She set it on the table. Verification confirmed, she said. Kalen looked up from the Eastern Border report he had been working through. His eyes asked the question. All sections authenticated as original, she said. The cut binding is confirmed as recent. The ledger entry for Aldrich Hest is confirmed as the relevant archive registration. The convergence argument in the 3rd section is formally recognized as legally valid reconstruction under Section 7 of the Interpretive Protocols. He set down his pen. In the 2 weeks since the tribunal halt, something had shifted in the texture of their days in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely because it happened in the small things rather than the large ones. He had spoken to his physician, fully and without the management he had been applying to that conversation for 18 months, and the treatment adjustment that resulted had made a visible difference by the end of the 1st week. Not recovery, which was not the word for something being managed rather than cured, but steadiness, the particular quality of a system that has been fighting its own support structure, finally receiving what it had been asking for. He was sleeping. She had not commented on this directly. She had simply noticed, in the way that she noticed everything, cataloging it, understanding it, letting it inform rather than performing a response to it. They had worked together every day, not ceremonially, not in the formal manner of a king and a provisional heir managing the appearance of collaboration. Actually worked. The Eastern Border situation required continued attention, even with Kane's withdrawal, because the underlying territorial pressures that had made Kane's plan attractive to his allies didn't disappear when the plan failed. The tribunal's formal session required extensive preparation. The succession documentation required the kind of systematic organization that had been neglected under the weight of the crisis. She had organized it. He had watched her organize it, with the expression of a man discovering that the thing he had been carrying alone was carrying differently with someone else's hands on it. They had argued 3 times in 2 weeks. Real arguments, the kind that require two people who are both actually present in the room, neither managing nor performing, actually disagreeing about something that matters. Once about the approach to the Eastern Territorial governors following Kane's withdrawal. Once about the phrasing of a specific clause in the succession formalization documents. Once about something smaller than either of those, something that was about the smaller friction of two people learning to share a working space, which was less about the thing they argued about and more about the fact of the argument itself, that it was possible, that it didn't collapse anything, that the foundation held under the weight of genuine disagreement. That third one was the most important, because a relationship that can only sustain agreement is not a relationship. It is a performance of agreement maintained by both parties' willingness to manage their own reactions. What the third argument demonstrated was that they were not managing, they were present. And presence, in the specific environment of two people who had both spent years managing their presence very carefully, was not small. On the 15th day, she gave him her answer. Not in a ceremony, not in the study. They were on the eastern wall where Kaelin had been when her convoy arrived. He came here in the mornings when the weather allowed. The physical height and cold air, and the specific labor of walking the wall, a form of clarity that the indoor rooms didn't quite replicate. She had started joining him. They were standing at the northeast corner where the wall met the older section of the fortress, and the mountain view opened up in three directions. The obsidian towers at their backs, and the territory spread before them in the particular early winter light that made everything seem both distant and sharply specific. She was looking at the mountain ridge. He was standing beside her. She said, "Yes." Just that. One word. The same word she had told him he would know before she said it. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. The thing about the answer she gave him, and this is worth sitting with, because this is the center of everything the story had been building toward, was that it was not a capitulation. It was not a concession to political necessity or to gratitude or to the particular pressure of having been brought to a place where yes was the obvious and convenient answer. The political necessity was real. The gratitude was real. The convenience was real. None of those things were why she said yes. She said yes because she had spent 3 weeks in the company of a man who had been honest with her when honesty cost him something, who had stood beside her in a room full of enemies without managing her or positioning her or using her as a display of his own strength, who had told her the truth about his body and his previous failures and his fear of intimacy at 3 a.m. in a cold archive, who had argued with her 3 times and lost one of those arguments cleanly and without residue, who had looked at her from the beginning with the specific quality of actual attention rather than assessment. She said yes because she had finally found someone who saw her before deciding what to do with her. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that had ever mattered. Yes, he repeated, not a question. The weight of a word landing in a person who had been holding space for it. Don't make it a declaration, she said. I wasn't going to, he said. Good. They stood on the wall for another few minutes. The empire spread before them in cold morning light. Seris thought about the woman who had stood in the Crimson Court 2 weeks ago watching rain on glass and storing betrayal where it would become useful. About the 6 years of careful, invisible competence that had produced, as its final yield, a dissolution decree and a fabricated bloodline discrepancy, and the particular indignity of being escorted out before dawn so the court could clear the air. She thought about what the woman she was now would say to that woman if such a conversation were possible. She would not say, "It gets better." That was too simple and too passive, the language of someone waiting for circumstances to improve. She would say, "You are already more than they think you are. You have always been more. The problem is not your worth. The problem is the address. You are living in a house built by other people's expectations, and the house does not fit. And the solution is not to remodel the house. The solution is to leave the house." She had left the house. She had walked north into obsidian and cold and a king who needed her for reasons both political and human, and she had built something in 3 weeks that 6 years in the Southern Court had never approached, the specific clarity of a person who knows what they are standing on. "We should go in," Kaelin said. "The tribunal representatives arrived this afternoon." "I know," she said. "Give me another minute." He gave her the minute. That was the thing about him that she had been cataloging since the courtyard on the first day. Not the grand gestures, not the operational competence, not the authority that the wolves of Varynth responded to with their instinctive lowered heads. The small things, the minute given, the chair pulled, the argument lost cleanly, the document handed over without condition. The truth told at 3 a.m. to a woman he had known for 3 days because she asked for it directly, and he had decided she deserved it. Power that manifests only in large actions is not power, it is performance of power. Real authority, the kind that actually changes the people subject to it, lives in the consistent small choices, the daily practice of treating people as capable of handling the truth, the refusal to manage others' perceptions at the expense of their actual understanding. She had never been in the presence of that before. It was, she was discovering, addictive in the way that any fundamental honesty becomes addictive once you have experienced it. Once you know what it feels like to be fully seen, the managed version of relationship becomes intolerable. Not because it is without value, because it is insufficient, because you have tasted the thing and can no longer accept the substitute. The minute ended. They went in. The tribunal session convened on the 20th day. The chamber where it was held was the formal hall of the capital's tribunal complex, larger than the administrative room where the night confrontation had happened, built for the specifically important function of making legal permanence. High ceilings. Stone floors. 6 tribunal members plus Vera Sol, 2 independent witnesses. Corin and 4 of Varynth's household guards standing at the back of the room without ceremony. Priska, who had remained in the capital during the 2 weeks, stood near the left wall. She had been in the capital managing practical logistics with the competence she applied to everything, and when Seris had found time to speak with her privately, their conversation had been the kind that happens between people who have been through something together and don't need to process it at length. Priska had looked at Seris with the particular quality of someone who had watched a person find their ground and was satisfied by the observation without needing to remark on it. The session began with the tribunal's verification report read aloud into the official record. It was comprehensive, dry, and completely clear in its conclusions. The founding compact sections were authenticated, the bloodline documentation was verified, the convergence argument was recognized under interpretive protocol. The archive irregularities were formally recorded as evidence in a separate proceeding that would address Aldrich Hest's actions and the Eastern Operations methods. Vera read each section without expression. When the verification report concluded, she looked up. The tribunal has received and confirmed the legal standing of the Vaelor bloodline claim, she said. The preliminary acknowledgement granted 2 weeks ago is hereby confirmed as permanent. She looked at Kylan. Your Majesty's declaration. Kaelin stepped forward. He had not prepared a speech. She knew this because she knew him by now, knew the way he used language, not for display, not for impression, but as a functional instrument, words chosen for what they needed to accomplish, and not for the additional weight of eloquence. He had told her he would say what was true. He said what was true. He said that the Vaelor bloodline was the founding blood of the Northern sovereign claim, and that recognizing it was not a political concession, but a legal and historical correction. He said that the succession question was resolved by the founding compact's own language, and that the tribunal's verification had confirmed what the archive had always contained. He said that the bonding declaration he was making before this chamber was the act of a king recognizing a sovereign equal and not the act of a king extending provision to a dependent. He said, "She is not here because I brought her. She is here because she belongs here." And then he stopped speaking, because that was what needed to be said, and he had said it. Vera looked at Seris. "Lady Vaelor," she said, "the tribunal requires your acknowledgement." Seris stepped forward. She thought about the Crimson Court, about the dissolution decree, about the fabricated bloodline discrepancy targeting the exact generation that mattered, about Aldrich Hest cutting a page in the dark and running east toward people who used him and disposed of him, about Savar Kane standing up quietly and walking to the door, already calculating, patient as a man who expected to have more time than he eventually did. She thought about the archive vault and the margin note in her own handwriting, and the 4 years of genealogical history that had been quietly pointing her toward a north she hadn't known to name. She thought about what it costs to keep something going when the structural support fails. Not the cost in effort, but the cost in the specific currency of self, the way that carrying too much alone for too long eventually produces a person who has forgotten what it feels like to share the weight. She looked at Kaelin. He looked back. "Lady Vaelor," Vera said again, gently but precisely. "Acknowledged," Seris said. She turned to the tribunal. "The claim is mine. The standing is mine. The declaration is received." She paused. "And I intend to do something with it." Vera allowed herself something that was not quite a smile. "I had no doubt," she said. The formal session concluded 40 minutes later. The documents were registered. The witnesses signed. The tribunal members departed with the particular efficiency of a body that had completed a function and was already moving to the next one. Corin and the household guard left without ceremony. Priska caught Seris's eye across the room as she was leaving. She gave a single nod. Seris gave one back. Then they were alone in the chamber. Kaelin and Seris and the stone floors and the high ceiling and the silence of a room that had just accomplished something permanent. He looked at the registered documents on the tribunal table. She looked at him. "How do you feel?" she said. It was a strange question to ask a king in a tribunal chamber, and both of them knew it, and neither of them cared. He considered it honestly, which was the only way he considered anything. "Like something I've been carrying at the wrong angle for a long time just shifted," he said. She understood that. She also understood that it was not the end of anything complicated. The Eastern Territories would need sustained management. The succession formalization would require months of practical implementation. Kane was standing down but not gone, patient as ever, already somewhere planning the long approach to whatever came next. The tribunal would have opinions. The Empire's various territorial governors would need to be addressed. The specific question of what it meant for two rulers to share an empire that had been run as a single authority for 11 years was not a question that resolved in a formal session. None of that was the point of this moment. The point of this moment was smaller and more absolute. A man who had been alone for too long in a fortress built from mountain bone, and a woman who had spent years being invisible in service of a future that never existed, standing together in a room where the record now said clearly what they were. "What do you want to do now?" she said. He thought about it. "Go home," he said. She looked at the documents, at the high windows of the tribunal chamber, at the city outside that was not hers, and was not his, but was simply the place the road had led. "Yes," she said. They left the capital in the late afternoon when the light had gone that specific gold that winterlight achieves for about 40 minutes before the dark takes over. The kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it's been there forever and belongs exactly where it is. The road north was the same road they had ridden south on in urgency, but it was different in the way that roads are different when you are no longer racing something. They rode without hard pace. The convoy was smaller. Corin, 4 riders, a single supply vehicle. No urgency, no parallel force on the ridge road. Just the mountain approach, and the altitude rising and the cold settling in with the commitment of a thing that had been waiting for permission. Kaelin rode beside her. On the second day, in the late afternoon, when the fortress was visible on the horizon, and the mountain air had that particular quality of a place that knew you were returning and had been going about its business without requiring your presence, he said something she had not been expecting. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She looked at him. "Not the governance," he said. "Not the legal structure. I know how to do that. I mean," he paused. "I have spent 11 years being very competent at things that require distance, and I am not certain I know how to be equally competent at the thing that requires proximity." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been doing it for 3 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not confident it holds." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she heard the thing he was actually saying, which was not a question about competence. It was the specific fear of a person who has finally found something worth keeping and has become, in the finding of it, more vulnerable to loss than they were before they found it. The fortress wall that had been protection for 11 years becoming, in this new context, not a wall at all. The armor that had been survival becoming something that sat differently on a person who had finally stopped being at war. That kind of unlearning is not comfortable. It is not simple. It requires the sustained daily practice of choosing presence over protection, which is a choice that has to be made again every day because the older habits do not simply disappear when you've decided against them. They wait. They represent themselves as reasonable caution, They disguise themselves as wisdom when they are actually fear-wearing wisdom's clothes. She knew this. She knew it because she had been doing the same unlearning. It doesn't hold by itself, she said. That's the thing nobody tells you about the kind of strength that actually matters. It's not a state you achieve. It's a practice. You do it wrong sometimes and you do it right more often than wrong, and over time the ratio changes. She looked ahead at the fortress on the horizon. You won't do it perfectly. Neither will I. But you've been honest with me every time I asked for it, and I've been honest with you, and that is the actual foundation. Not the founding compact, not the bloodline, not the tribunal's registered documents. She paused. The thing you do every day when you choose honesty over management. That's the foundation. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have been a chancellor." She laughed. It surprised both of them. Not because laughter was foreign, but because this particular laugh was the laugh of a person who has finally relaxed the last held thing, the last managed, careful piece of presentation, and is simply present in the moment without requiring it to be anything other than what it is. He looked at her laughing, and something settled in his face that had not been settled when she first saw him on the fortress steps. Not softer, not unguarded in the sense of exposed, but present in the way of a person who has arrived. They rode into Varynth as the last light went. The wolves moved into their patterns. The fortress breathed its mountain breath. The torches in the outer brackets were burning against the cold, and the obsidian walls held the dark the way they had held it for centuries, without effort and without comment. In the archive below, the founding compact rested in its vault with the cut binding and the missing page and the 3 centuries of sovereign continuity that had survived falsification and forged dissolution, decrees, and a man's careful, invisible architecture, because the truth of bloodlines, like the truth of character, is not actually destroyed by the documents that attempt to deny it. It waits. And in the study above, where 2 people spread the work of an empire across a table worn by years of use and bent together over the ordinary business of governing a territory that required everything they had, the fire moved the same way it always had, without caring about the significance of the room it occupied, simply doing its work, throwing its light, keeping out the cold the way that small, persistent things have always kept out the cold. Not by being enormous, by being present, by not going out. Seris Vaelor had arrived in the north believing that exile was the shape of her failure. She had discovered it was the shape of her correction. She had been sent to the wrong house and walked to the right one, and found, in the archive beneath it, the evidence that she had been standing on solid ground all along, that the diminishment was always a lie, that the performance of her smallness had been someone else's requirement, that the name she had lived inside for 26 years was not the whole name. And Kaelin Draven had spent 11 years building an empire's machinery with the precise and sustained effort of a man who had decided, somewhere in the early years of his rule, that the thing he was most afraid of was the thing he could least afford to pursue. Not governance, not warfare, not the long grinding work of keeping fractious territories from tearing themselves apart. Intimacy, the specific vulnerability of being known. He had been extraordinary at the things that required him to perform invincibility, and he had been quietly, privately, failing at the only thing that would eventually matter more than all of it, the willingness to be present with another person without the armor on. Not because the armor was wrong, the armor had been necessary. The armor had kept him functional through 11 years of bearing alone what should have been shared. But there comes a point in every life built on controlled strength where the question is no longer whether you can carry it. You have proven you can carry it. The question becomes, what are you carrying it for? And what was it worth, the empire, the obsidian fortress, and the founding compact, and the wolves who lowered their heads, and the territory spread across the mountain approaches like an argument that had resolved in favor of endurance? What was it worth if at the center of it was a man who had forgotten how to be known? It was worth less. And the iron crown that waited in the sealed vault, old as the mountains and heavier than any metal, forged in the particular alloy of sovereignty and sacrifice, it was not waiting for a conqueror. It never had been. It was waiting for someone who understood what crowns actually cost. Not the throne, not the territory, not the political architecture of succession and legitimacy and the tribunal's registered documents. The cost was this: you cannot rule well what you do not actually inhabit. You cannot govern people you have not allowed yourself to be among. You cannot sustain an empire built on the performance of invincibility because performance is not infrastructure. It cracks. It fails. It leaves you standing alone on the highest possible platform with the least possible ground beneath you. The crown cost presence. It cost the daily choosing of honesty over management, of proximity over protection, of being seen over being impressive. It cost everything that the armor had been protecting. And the man and woman who spread their work across the study table in the obsidian fortress while snow gathered outside and the fire did its patient work had already begun paying that cost. Not completely. Not perfectly. Not in the way of people who had resolved all of their complications and arrived at a clean, safe altitude above the difficulty of being human. In the way of people who had decided to keep paying it, every day, together. The wolves moved through Varynth beneath snowfall. The empire breathed, and the Iron Crown rested in the dark below. Not as symbol, not as weight, as the record of everything that had been survived and chosen and built by the people brave enough to carry it honestly, which was, in the end, the only way any crown had ever been worth wearing at all.